Clara Whitmore went down on both knees in the dust outside the Black River Gate and held up her dead husband's wedding ring to a man she had never met. "Take it," she said. "I'd sooner sell the last thing I ever loved than stand here and beg you for bread." The rancher on the horse did not reach for the ring. He looked at the berry stains on her shaking hands, and instead of pity, he asked her one quiet question that would change the whole of both their lives. "Before I tell you what he said, do me a kindness. Subscribe to the channel, stay with Clara, clear to the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me which town or city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now, settle in, because it starts right here on a road in Montana Territory, with a hungry woman who refused to look down. The rancher's name was Thomas Caldwell, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He sat that horse like a man who had learned the hard way that words spent too fast were words wasted. His eyes went from the ring to her face and back to the ring, and Clara felt the old shame rise up in her throat, the way it always did. Hot and familiar, the shame that had followed her out of that town like a stray dog she couldn't shake. "Put your hand down, ma'am," he said finally. "I don't want your charity. I didn't offer you any." His voice was low and even. "Put your hand down before you drop that ring in the dirt and spend an hour looking for it." Clara lowered her hand. She did not, however, lower her chin. That much she had left, and she meant to keep it. "You've been walking a while," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 days. "Eating what?" She glanced down at her own fingers, at the purple stains there, and she would not lie to him. Whatever the birds hadn't gotten to first. Thomas Caldwell swung down off the horse. He did it slow, the way a man does when he doesn't want to spook a frightened animal, and Clara hated that she understood the gesture, hated that she was the frightened animal. He stood there in front of her, tall and dust-colored and tired, a widower himself, though she didn't know it yet, and he looked at her the way no man in Culpeper had looked at her in 2 long years. He looked at her like she was a person. "There's a bush of chokecherries yonder that'll turn your insides to water," he said. "You keep eating those, you won't make it to the next fence line, let alone the next town." "I wasn't planning on the next town." "No." He tipped his hat back an inch. "What were you planning on?" And there it was. The question under the question. Clara had learned to hear those. 2 years of being talked around, talked over, and talked down to had given her an ear for the thing a man really meant. This man wanted to know if she was fixing to lie down in his ditch and die on his land and leave him the trouble of the burying. "I was planning," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "on finding honest work before my legs gave out. Turns out my legs are faster than the work." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Thomas Caldwell was not a man who gave smiles away for free either, but something. "What kind of work does a woman do?" he asked. "Who walks 3 days into cattle country carrying nothing but a bag and a wedding ring?" "Any kind that pays." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got left." He studied her a while longer. Somewhere off past the gate, a cow bawled low and lonesome, and the wind came down off the high country, carrying the smell of sage and coming heat. Clara stood there under his gaze and made herself hold still. She had been looked at plenty. She knew the difference between a man taking her measure and a man taking his amusement, and she waited to see which one this would turn out to be. "I lost my cook 2 weeks ago," Thomas said. "Ran off to the silver camps with a man half his sense and twice his debts. I've got 11 hands eating cold beans out of a tin and cussing me for it, and a kitchen that hasn't seen a broom since my wife passed." He paused, and the pause had weight in it, the weight of a thing not said. "Can you cook for 2? Clara blinked. It was such a strange, small question. 2. Not 11, not a whole outfit of hungry men. 2. And she understood standing there that he was giving her a door she could walk through with her pride still on. He wasn't asking could she keep a bunkhouse fed. He was asking quiet and sideways whether she could do the one plain thing a body needs doing, whether there was use in her, whether she was worth the feeding of. She straightened her shoulders. She felt every ache in her back and every blister on her heel, and she looked that man dead in the eye. "Mister," she said, "I can cook for 20. This time the thing at the corner of his mouth almost got away from him. "We'll see," he said. He bent and picked up the small worn bag at her feet before she could stop him, and he slung it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing, though everything Clara Whitmore had left in this world was inside it. "You ride or you walk?" "I've been walking 3 days. I'll walk the last mile." "Suit yourself, ma'am." He clicked his tongue and the horse fell in beside him. "But if you fall down in my road, I'm not carrying you. I've got a bad shoulder and a worse temper." He was lying about at least one of those, and Clara knew it, and she suspected he knew she knew. She fell in a step behind him, and for the first time in 3 days, in 3 weeks, in longer than she cared to count, Clara Whitmore walked toward something instead of away from it. She did not cry. She had promised herself back in Culpeper that she was done crying where men could see it. But her throat ached the whole way up that road, and it wasn't hunger. The town that had thrown her out was called Culpeper, and Clara had married into it 8 years back. A green bride of 21, with a good hand for numbers and a better one for bread. Her husband was Daniel Whitmore, a gentle, laughing man who could fix any broken thing but his own bad luck. And for a short while, they had been happy on their little quarter section at the edge of the valley. Daniel took the fever in the winter of '82. It went into his lungs and it stayed there, and it took him slow over 4 months while Clara sold the cow, and then the second horse, and then her mother's silver to pay the doctor who could not save him. By the time she buried Daniel in the frozen ground, there was nothing left but the land itself and the paper the land was tied to, and the paper was held by the bank. Clara had kept Daniel's books the whole of their marriage, every figure, every debt, every dollar in, and every dollar out, in a neat firm hand that never blotted. She knew to the penny what they owed. So when the banker came riding out that spring with his ledger and his soft voice and told her the debt was near twice what she had written down, Clara had done a thing that no widow in Culpeper had ever done before her. She'd argued. "That figure's wrong," she'd said, standing in her own doorway with the wind cutting through her thin black dress. "I've got the notes. I wrote every one of them myself. Daniel borrowed 400 against the spring planting and paid back 200 at the fall sale. You've got him down for 8. The banker had smiled at her. She would remember that smile a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he'd said, gentle as anything, "grief does terrible things to a woman's recollection. These are the bank's figures. The bank does not make mistakes." "I'm not mistaken." "Then you're calling me a liar. In front of witnesses." He'd nodded toward the 2 men he'd brought with him, big men who did not meet her eyes. "That's a serious thing for a woman in your position to be doing, ma'am. A woman alone with no husband to speak for her and no money to speak with. I'd think very hard before I said another word." And that had been the whole of it. She'd had the truth, and he'd had the paper, and the men, and the town. And when a woman has only the truth, Clara had learned the truth is a poor kind of shield. They'd put her off the land in April. The neighbors she'd fed through 2 hard winters had watched from their porches and said not one word. That was the part Clara couldn't forgive. Not the losing of the land could be lost. Land was only dirt. It was the porches. It was every face she'd baked bread for, turning away from her at once like she was something spoiled they were embarrassed to have known. She let herself go something awful after Daniel. She'd heard one of them say a woman named Mrs. Pratt, whose babies Clara had helped birth. Can't hardly blame a body for not wanting to look, because that was the other thing. Somewhere in the years of the marriage, and worse in the year of Daniel's dying, Clara had grown broad. Grief had done part of it, and the hard, cheap food of poverty had done the rest. And by the time she stood in that doorway, arguing with the banker, she had become in the town's eyes not a widow to be pitied, but a spectacle to be discussed. The large widow. That was what they called her when they thought she couldn't hear, and often when they knew she could. Her mind, her hands, her steady, honest books. The 8 years she'd fed half that valley from her own oven. None of it counted for a thing against the plain fact of her body. They had decided what she was by looking, and once a town decides what you are by looking, there is no arguing your way out of it. She had learned that too. So Clara Whitmore had put on her one good pair of boots and walked north with everything she owned in a bag, and she had told herself she would rather starve honest on a stranger's road than eat one more meal in a town that had made up its mind about her, which was very nearly what she had done. "You're quiet," Thomas said near the top of the rise. "I'm walking. You can do both. I've found I don't do my best thinking hungry." He glanced back at her. "Fair," he said, and she thought that was the end of it. But a dozen steps on, he said, "Where'd you come up from?" "Culpeper. South and east of here past the Mussel Shell." Something happened in his face when she said the name. It was quick, and he covered it fast, but Clara had spent 2 years reading the small movements men made when they were hiding a thing, and she caught it. "You know it?" she asked. "I know the bank there," he said, and there was iron in his voice now that hadn't been there before. "Same outfit's got its hooks into half the ranches between here and the river. Holloway." Clara stopped walking. She hadn't meant to. Her legs simply quit the way they'd threatened to quit for 3 days, and for one swimming moment, she thought the hunger had finally caught her. But it wasn't the hunger. It was the name. Richard Holloway. The soft voice, and the softer smile, and the ledger with the wrong figures written in it in a fine flowing hand. "Ma'am?" Thomas had turned fully, now the horse's reins loose in his fist. "You all right?" "That's the man," Clara said. Her voice came out strange to her own ears, flat and far away. "That's the man that took my land." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the shift of the horse's weight from one leg to another. "Richard Holloway took your farm," Thomas said slowly. "He said we owed twice what we did. I had the books. I had every figure. It didn't matter." She heard herself say it, and she hated the crack that came into the words at the end. "He smiled at me, and he said the bank doesn't make mistakes, and he put me off my own land in April with my husband 3 months in the ground." Thomas Caldwell was quiet a long while. When he spoke again, his voice had gone low and careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is holding a thing down hard. "Come on up to the house," he said. "We'll talk about Holloway when you've got something in your belly. A body can't hate a man proper on an empty stomach. It's a thing I know." And Clara, who had been ready to hate every man alive not 2 hours before, followed him up over the rise, and got her first look at the ranch that would either be the saving of her or the ruin of her, and she did not yet know which. The Black River outfit was bigger than anything Culpeper could boast, but Clara saw at once that it was an outfit running hard on one man's willpower and not much else. There was work everywhere, and rest nowhere. The corrals were sound, but the fences past them sagged. There was fresh paint on the barn, and none at all on the house, and the yard between them had the look of a place where men passed through fast and never lingered. They came out of the bunkhouse and the barn as Thomas rode in, the way men do when a stranger enters a place, and Clara felt every one of their eyes fix on her, and then travel her slow from her worn boots to her broad hips to her sunburnt face, and she saw the look pass around from man to man like a bottle. She knew the look. She had spent 2 years drinking from that same bottle. "Boss brought back a stray," one of them said. "Not quiet enough. He was young and lean with a mean cast to his mouth, and he leaned on the corral rail like he owned it. And a big one, too. What do we feed her on Deke the whole herd?" A few of the men laughed. Not all. Clara noticed that. Not all of them laughed. "That'll do, Court," said an older man, gray at the temples, with a foreman's flat and level way of standing. "Deke, then." He didn't laugh, but he didn't look at her friendly either. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's been told to buy and isn't sure he wants. Thomas swung down. He didn't raise his voice. Clara would come to learn that Thomas Caldwell almost never raised his voice, and that men jumped faster for his quiet than they ever had for another man's shouting. "This is Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "She's our new cook. She'll have the kitchen and the run of the house, and any man that's got a complaint about the cooking can bring it to me, and any man that's got a complaint about the cook can bring it to me too, and I'll see he's got the leisure to think it over while he digs post holes." He let that sit. That clear boss said a couple of them. Court said nothing. He was still looking at Clara with that mean twist to his mouth, and Clara looked right back at him, because she had learned that too, that you never let the mean ones see you flinch. "You'll want to see the kitchen," Thomas said to her quieter. "I'll warn you now, it's bad." "I've seen bad. Not like this." He was right. It was worse than bad. Clara stood in the doorway of that kitchen and felt something in her go still and cold, and certain the way it did when there was a real job of work in front of her, a thing she could put her hands to. The stove was choked with old grease. The flour in the barrel had gone to weevils. There were tin plates crusted with the ghosts of 100 cold suppers, and a smell over the whole of it that she didn't care to name. The last man, Thomas said behind her, wasn't much of a cook. The last man, Clara said, wasn't much of anything. She set her bag down on the one clean corner of the table. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. She turned and looked at the man who had 2 hours ago been a stranger on a road, and she felt the first thing she'd felt in months that wasn't grief or shame or hunger. She felt useful. "I'll need hot water," she said, "and a boy to fetch and carry, and I'll need you to keep your men out from underfoot till I'm done. Supper'll be late tonight. It won't be late again." Thomas looked at the wreck of his kitchen, and then at the woman standing in the middle of it, with her sleeves rolled and her chin up, and for the first time that day, he smiled all the way, and it changed his whole tired face. "Toby," he called out the door, "get in here. You just became a cook's boy." The boy that came was maybe 14, all elbows and ears, and he stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of the mess and the woman both. "You Toby?" Clara asked. "Yes'm." "You afraid of hot water and hard work?" "No, ma'am." He thought about it. "Well, some." "Good. A man ought to have the sense to be a little afraid of hard work. Means he respects it." She handed him the water bucket. "Fill this and come back running. We've got a kitchen to raise from the dead." They worked till the light went gold and then gray. Clara scrubbed the stove down to iron and blacked it fresh. She threw out the weevil flour and cursed the waste of it under her breath. She found in the back of a low cupboard a sack of good beans and a side of bacon and a bin of potatoes gone soft but salvageable, and she found something else too. Something that made her stop and go still. She found the books. They were shoved in behind the flour barrel, a ledger, and a sheaf of loose papers, and she knew a ledger the way some people know a face. She pulled it out and wiped the dust from the cover, and she did not open it. Not then, because it wasn't hers to open. But she set it aside, careful on the clean corner of the table by her bag, and she filed away in the back of her mind the fact of it the way she filed away every useful thing. Supper was late that first night like she'd promised, but it came. She made a beef stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, with the salvaged potatoes and wild onion Toby dug from the creek bank. And she baked bread, real bread in the cleaned oven, the first real bread that kitchen had seen in 2 years. When she carried the pot out to the long table in the cook shack, the men fell quiet, the way men do, uncertain, and Clara felt her heart drop, because she knew that quiet too. It was the quiet that came just before the cruelty. Court broke it. Of course it was Court. "Smells better than I figured," he said, for a woman that eats better than she cooks by the look of her. The shack went dead still. Clara set the pot down on the table. She did it careful and unhurried, and she straightened up, and she looked down the length of that table at the lean, mean young man with the twist to his mouth, and every man there was watching to see what she'd do. "You're right to wonder," Clara said, easy as you please. "A cook that won't eat her own food. Now that's a cook you can't trust. So I'll tell you what." She picked up a clean bowl. She ladled it full, and she sat herself down at the end of the bench, and she ate the first spoonful right there in front of all of them. She let out a slow breath. "That," she said, "is a good stew." Then she looked back up at Court. "Your turn," she said. "Unless you'd rather go hungry to prove a point. Some men would. I've known a few. Never met one yet grew fat on his own pride." There was a beat of silence, and then Deke, the gray foreman, made a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been a laugh, and reached past Court for the ladle. "Well, I ain't too proud to eat," Deke said. He filled his bowl. He took a bite. He chewed. And every man at that table watched the foreman's weathered face, the way sailors watch the sky. Deke set down his spoon. He looked at Clara. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I've eaten trail cooking 22 years, and I've eaten one meal in my life better than this, and that was my mother's, and she's been dead since Antietam." He picked the spoon back up. "You can stay." The table broke. Bowls went down the line hand over hand, and men who'd cussed the cold beans for 2 weeks were suddenly shoving each other to reach the pot. And the shack filled up with the sound of eating, and then slow at first, and then easy, the sound of men talking, the way men talk when their bellies are getting full, and the day's work is behind them. Only Court didn't eat. He sat there a while with his arms crossed and his mean mouth working. And then when he thought no one was watching, he reached out and filled a bowl for himself and ate it fast in the corner with his back half turned, and Clara saw it and said not one word, because she had learned that too. You let the mean ones save their face. It costs you nothing, and it buys you peace at least for a while. Thomas came in at the tail of it. He stood in the doorway and looked at his men at the empty pot and the mopped clean bowls and the easy noise of the place, and Clara watched something move over his face that she couldn't name, something that looked almost like grief and almost like relief, and was maybe both. "I take it," he said, "supper went all right." "There's a plate kept warm for you," Clara said. "By the stove. You eat last around here, I noticed. Foreman told me, said you always have." Thomas didn't answer that. He went and got his plate, and he sat down at the end of the bench, apart the way she suspected he always sat, and he ate his supper in the noise of his own men without joining it, and Clara watched him do it and understood something about Thomas Caldwell that she hadn't understood on the road. He was as alone in the middle of his own outfit as she had been in the middle of Culpeper. He just hid it better because a man is allowed to. Later, when the men had gone off to the bunkhouse and Toby had washed the last bowl and been sent yawning to bed, Clara sat by the banked stove with the ledger she'd found, and finally, because it was late and no one would see and she couldn't help herself, she opened it. She was a bookkeeper before she was anything else. Before she was a widow, before she was a stray on a road, before she was the large widow of Culpeper, she had been a girl who was good with figures better than her brothers, better than the schoolmaster said a girl had any business being. And what she saw in that ledger, in the light of one low lamp, made her go cold all the way through. The figures were wrong, not sloppy. Not the honest mistakes of a busy man who kept his own books between roundups. Wrong on purpose. Wrong in a particular familiar clever way that Clara Whitmore had seen exactly once before in her life, in a banker's ledger held out to a grieving widow in a cold doorway in Culpeper. The interest was compounding where it had no business compounding. There were charges entered twice under names dressed up to look different. There was a livestock assessment fee that appeared 4 times in 18 months and answered to no law or lender Clara had ever heard of. And running through all of it, threaded through the whole rotten weave of it, the same hand, the same fine flowing hand, initialing the margins. She knew that hand. "You're up late." Clara nearly came out of her chair. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and she hadn't heard him come, and for a wild second, she thought to slap the ledger shut and pretend. But she had done too much pretending in her life. She was tired of it, clear to the bone. "This is your book," she said instead. "I found it behind the flower. I had no business opening it, and I opened it anyway, and I'm not going to lie to you about it." He came in slow. He set his hat on the table. And you're being robbed." The word sat in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped in a still pond. "I know the market's down," Thomas said carefully. "Cattle prices fell out from under everybody this year. I'm behind on a loan, I know that. But robbed's a strong word, ma'am, and I'd want to know how a woman found that out in one evening with a book she'd never seen, because I've read this exact book before." Clara turned the ledger around and pushed it across the table toward him, and she put her finger on the doubled charges on the phantom assessment fees, on the fine flowing initials in the margin. "Only that time it had my husband's name on the front of it instead of yours. This is how Holloway does it." He doesn't take a ranch all at once. He bleeds it. He adds a little here and doubles a little there, small enough you don't catch it patient as a spider, and he waits for one bad year, a drought, or a market fall, or a dead husband, and then he calls the whole thing due at once, and there's no fighting the figure because it's been sitting in the book for 2 years, looking legal. She looked up at him. How long's Holloway held your paper? Thomas Caldwell stared down at the open ledger. The lamp threw long shadows up the walls, and his face in that light looked older than his 38 years and harder. 2 years, he said quietly. Since Eleanor passed. Since I got behind on the notes. And how long, Clara asked, since he started coming around himself, not sending a clerk? Coming himself with that soft voice, being kind to you. Thomas's jaw worked. Spring, he admitted. He's been out here 3 times since spring. Said he wanted to see the operation. Said he had faith in me. He said that to my Daniel, too. Clara closed the ledger gentle the way you close a thing that has teeth. A man like Holloway doesn't come himself and doesn't say kind things unless he's already decided a ranch is worth the taking. The kindness is the last thing before the knife. I know because I heard the same kindness in the same voice, and 30 days later I was walking north with a bag. For a long time, Thomas Caldwell said nothing. Outside, an owl called once and once again, and the wind moved along the eaves of the old unpainted house. You said you kept your husband's books, he said at last. Every day of 8 years. You could read this. All of it chapter and verse. Give me a week, and every scrap of paper you've got, notes, receipts, bills of sale, all of it, and I'll tell you to the penny how much that man has stolen from you and exactly how he's done it. Clara heard her own voice go hard and sure, harder and surer than it had been in 2 years. And she realized she was not tired anymore. Not the deep tired she'd been on the road. Something had woke up in her. Something the town of Culpeper had tried to bury and hadn't quite managed to. And when I'm done, you won't have a grievance. You'll have proof. There's a difference, Mr. Caldwell. I learned it the hard way. Grievance is what a widow has, and nobody listens to a widow. Proof is what a widow wishes she'd had written down and dated, and impossible to smile away. Thomas looked at her across the lamplit table for a long, long moment. And then he did a thing that no man in Culpeper had done in 2 years. He looked at her, all of her, the worn dress and the broad shoulders and the sunburnt, honest face, and there was not one grain of the old bottle-passing look in it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has badly underestimated. This morning, he said slowly, I hired a cook. You did. Seems I got more than I bargained for. You got exactly what you bargained for, Clara said. A woman who can cook for 20. You just didn't ask what else she could do. Men generally don't. She stood and gathered the lamp, and her own tiredness came back over her all at once now that the fire in her had said its piece. Get some sleep, Mr. Caldwell. Bring me the papers in the morning, and don't say a word to your men about any of this. Not one, not even the foreman. If Holloway's as patient as I think he's got at least one ear in this outfit already. He did in mine. She left him standing there in the dark kitchen with the ledger in his hands, and she climbed the narrow stairs to the little room off the pantry that would be hers, and she lay down on a real bed for the first time in 3 days. She thought she'd drop straight to sleep. She was wrong. She lay awake a long time in the dark, and it was not hunger that kept her, and it was not the strangeness of the bed. It was the thing that had woke up in her down in that kitchen. For 2 years she had been a woman things happened to. Her husband died, and she was widowed. Her land was stolen, and she was robbed. Her town turned on her, and she was cast out. Happened to happen to happen to. Like she was a field, the weather worked its will on. But down in that kitchen tonight, for the first time since Daniel took his last hard breath, Clara Whitmore had been a woman who could make a thing happen instead. She had knowledge that mattered. She had a wrong she understood better than any lawyer because she'd bled from it herself. And she had improbably a man who had listened to her, really listened, who had not smiled and told her that grief muddled a woman's recollection. It was almost too much to bear being listened to. She hadn't known how much she'd missed it until it happened, and then it near broke her. Down the hall she heard Thomas Caldwell's boots come up the stairs slow and heavy, and pause a moment outside her door, and then go on to his own room. He'd checked she understood, made sure she was settled, made sure the stray he'd brought in off the road was seen to. And Clara lay in the dark and felt her eyes sting, and this time, since no man could see her, she let the tears come, and they were not the bitter kind she'd cried in Culpeper. They were something else. Something with a little hope hidden in it, small and stubborn as a seed under snow. Morning came hard and early the way it does on a ranch. Clara was up before the light, the fire already going coffee, already boiling. And when the men shuffled in for breakfast, bleary and half awake, they found flapjacks and bacon and biscuits and gravy waiting. And the shack that had been so full of cruelty the night before was full, instead of the small sounds of contentment of forks and low talk, and a man asking politely, actually politely, for the syrup to be passed. Court came in last. He filled his plate without a word. He ate in his corner. But Clara noticed he came, and Clara noticed he ate, and Clara noticed the way the other men had already in a single night begun to close ranks around the cook they'd have laughed at on the road, and she filed it all away because a woman who means to fight a patient spider had best be patient too, and had best know exactly who she can count on when the web starts to shake. It was near mid-morning when the rider came. Clara heard him before she saw him. The hard, fast drum of a horse pushed harder than a sensible man pushes a horse, and she came out onto the porch wiping her hands on her apron in time to see him haul up in the yard in a boil of dust. He was a town man, soft in the saddle, in a good coat gone gray with the road, and he had the look Clara knew well, the look of a man who runs another man's errands and has grown proud on it, the way a small dog grows fierce behind a big fence. "Caldwell," he called out. "Thomas Caldwell, I've got a letter for you from the bank." Thomas came out of the barn unhurried, wiping his hands on a rag, and Clara saw the men drift up from their work one by one to stand at the edges of the yard, quiet, watching the way men do when the smell of trouble comes riding in. "I'm Caldwell," Thomas said. The rider leaned down and held out a folded paper sealed with wax. "From Mr. Holloway himself," he said, and there was a relish in the way he said the name, like it was something to be proud to carry. "He said to put it in your hand and wait for you to read it so I can tell him you read it." Those were his words. Thomas took the letter. He broke the seal slow. Clara watched his eyes go down the page, and she watched his jaw set, and she knew before he said a word that the spider had felt her step onto the web and was already spinning faster. "Well," the writer said, "you read it. I read it. And—" Thomas folded the letter back along its crease, careful the way Clara had folded the ledger the night before. "You can tell Mr. Holloway," he said, "that I read every word." The rider waited a moment for more, and when no more came, his soft face pinched up. "He'll want an answer. He'll get one," Thomas said. "In 2 weeks, same as his letter says. You've done your errand, mister. There's water at the trough for your horse. There's none for you." He turned his back on the man and walked toward the porch toward Clara, and behind him the rider sat his blowing horse a moment longer, red in the face, and then wheeled around and lit out the way he'd come faster than he'd need to, the way a man rides when he's been made small in front of strangers. Thomas came up the porch steps and put the letter in Clara's hand without a word. She read it. It was short. It was on its face the politest thing in the world. Mr. Holloway wrote that, in light of the poor cattle market and his abiding concern for the welfare of the Black River operation, he would be doing Mr. Caldwell the personal courtesy of riding out in 2 weeks' time to review the account in full and discuss arrangements for the outstanding balance. He looked forward, he wrote, to resolving the matter to the satisfaction of all parties. 2 weeks, Clara said quietly. 2 weeks. He's not coming to review the account. She read it again, and every soft word in it turned to iron as she read, because she'd heard every one of them before in a cold doorway in Culpeper. He's coming to call the whole thing due. This is the kindness before the knife. I told you. He wrote near the same letter to Daniel, only Daniel was too sick to read it, and I read it to him, and 30 days later we were off the land. This is him telling you it's decided. He's giving you 2 weeks to be scared, so you'll be soft and grateful when he offers to buy you out for 1/10 of what it's worth and call it mercy. Thomas's hands closed slow into fists at his sides. Then 2 weeks is what we've got. 2 weeks is what we've got. Clara agreed, and she looked down at the box that sat unopened, and up at the man beside her, and the size of the thing settled over her cold and clear. 2 years, Holloway had worked to build his lie patient and unhurried. She had 14 days to tear it down. It was as she turned to go back inside that she saw Court. He was standing apart from the other men over by the corner of the bunkhouse, and he was not looking at Thomas, and he was not looking at the road where the rider had gone. He was looking at Clara, and there was something in his face, quick and gone, that was not the mean laughing thing she'd seen the night before. It was closer to calculation. It was the look of a man doing sums. Clara held his eye a half-second too long, and Court looked away first, and pushed off the bunkhouse wall and went back to his work with his shoulders hunched. And Clara felt the small cold certainty she'd learned in Culpeper settle into her belly like a swallowed stone. There was an ear in this outfit, just like there'd been one in hers, and she thought she'd just found it. She said nothing to Thomas. Not yet. A woman doesn't accuse a man's hand without proof she'd learned that to learn it. Watching the town accuse her of things with nothing but a look. But she filed it away with all the rest, and she resolved to keep the ledger and the box and every scrap of what she was doing behind a locked pantry door and a story about inventory, and to watch Court Mabry the way you watch a dog you're not sure of, friendly and easy, and never once with your back full turned. Something wrong? Thomas asked low. He'd seen her watching, though maybe not what she'd watched. Everything's wrong, Clara said. That's why you hired me. She managed the smallest edge of a smile, and it cost her, but she gave it to him anyway because she'd seen how tired the man was, and a body needs something to hold when the water's rising. But wrong is a thing I know how to work with, Mr. Caldwell. Right now, right I never got the hang of, never had the luck to practice. Wrong, though. Wrong I could do in my sleep. Something eased in his face just a little. You always talk like this. Only when I've decided to fight, Clara said. Ask the town of Culpeper. They found me a good deal quieter right up until the end. Thomas Caldwell looked at her a long moment, and Clara had the strange feeling of being weighed on a scale that had for 2 years only ever come up short, and finding this once, that the beam had swung the other way. Come inside, he said. Both of us. Now, before the men are back at the table. There's things in that box you'll want to see before Holloway's dust is on the road again, and there's 14 days to see them in, and I've got the feeling you don't mean to waste a one. They went in together, out of the hard, bright yard, and into the cool of the house, and Thomas shut the door behind them, and for the first time in 2 years, and maybe the first time since Eleanor, he was not carrying the weight of the place alone. Thomas came to the table and set the wooden box down on the end of it, beside her, quiet. And Clara looked at it and knew without being told what it was. Every paper he had. Every note and receipt and bill of sale. 2 years of a ranch's life, and buried somewhere in it the exact shape of a theft. That's the last of it, Thomas said low just for her. That's everything Holloway's ever handed me, and everything I ever signed. Clara set down her coffee. She lifted the lid of the box and drew out the paper that lay on top, the newest one. And it was a statement of account not 3 months old, and she read it once quick, the way she read everything, and then she went very still. What is it? Thomas asked. He's already started. Clara laid the paper flat and turned it toward him and set her finger under a line near the bottom. You see that reassessment of secured stock per revised valuation. That's a made-up thing, Mr. Caldwell. That's not a fee, it's not interest, it's not a law. It's a sentence he wrote to move $400 from your side of the book to his, and he did it in March, quiet, hoping you'd sign the next note without adding down the column. She looked up at him, and her voice was very level, and very cold, and very sure. He's been in your pocket $400 since spring, and this is one paper off the top that I've read for 10 seconds. There'll be more. There's always more. Thomas stared at the line under her finger. $400, he said quietly. I signed that. I signed it, and I never saw it. No, Clara said. You weren't meant to. That's the whole art of it. She rested her hand flat on the top of that box, and she felt the old certainty settle into her. The thing that was better than hope, because it asked no permission and made no promises. The plain, hard certainty of a woman who has found honest work she is uniquely fit to do. Then let's find out. Clara said, exactly what it's going to take to make Richard Holloway sorry he ever rode out to Black River. And across the table, Thomas Caldwell looked at her. This woman he'd found kneeling in his road not one full day before this woman his men had laughed at, and his town would have scorned, and he did not laugh, and he did not scorn. He tipped his hat to her. Just an inch. The way a man does to someone he has decided is worth the courtesy. Yes, ma'am, he said. Let's. They worked the box the way other people work a mine, one paper at a time, and Clara made 2 piles on the table between them. This pile's honest, she said, laying down a bill of sale. This pile lies. The lying pile grew faster. By the second hour, she had stopped saying much at all. She'd wet the pencil against her lip and run the figures down the margin of a butcher paper sheet, adding, carrying, crossing out. And Thomas sat across from her and watched a thing he had never once seen in his life. A person doing sums, the way he broke a horse, all patience and no wasted motion until the numbers gave up and told the truth. There, she said, and set the pencil down. $62 in doubled interest, $400 on the March reassessment, $110 in a holding fee that isn't a thing, and this. She slid 1 paper to the top. This is the one that matters, Mr. Caldwell. This is the one that hangs him. Thomas leaned in. It's a note. I signed plenty of notes. Read the date. August of last year. Now look at your own hand on the line below. Clara laid a second note beside it, an honest one of the pile she trusted. That's you. Same man, same pen, both signatures. Look at the way your T leans. Look at how you cross it low. She tapped the August note. Now look at the T on this one. Thomas Caldwell went very still. That's not my hand, he said slowly. No, it's a good copy. It'd fool a clerk, it'd fool a judge on a busy day. But it's not yours. Somebody sat down with 3 of your real signatures and practiced, and then they wrote you into a debt you never took on for $400 dated to a month you were up in the high pasture with the herd and couldn't have signed anything. She looked up at him. Were you in August? I was gone 11 days after Strays. Deke can swear to it. Half the outfit can. Then that, Clara said quietly, is forgery, not sharp dealing, not a hard bargain, a crime a man can hang for or near enough. And Richard Holloway put his own initials in the margin of it because he's grown so used to nobody ever checking that he got careless. She sat back. We don't have a grievance anymore, Mr. Caldwell. We've got a forger's own confession in his own hand in a box he never dreamed a bookkeeper would open. For a moment, Thomas didn't speak. Then he stood up so fast the bench scraped, and he walked to the window and put both hands flat on the sill, and Clara saw his shoulders working. 2 years, he said low. 2 years I sat across a table from that man and shook his hand and thanked him for his patience. I thanked him. He turned around. Eleanor used to say I trusted too easy. She said it'd cost me one day. It didn't cost you, Clara said. It nearly did. There's a difference, and the difference is 14 days, and a woman who's read this book before. She squared the papers. But we've got to be smart. A forged note in a box does us no good if the box burns, and I promise you once Holloway learns there's someone here who can read what he wrote, that box is the first thing he'll come for. Which brings me to the thing I haven't told you. She met his eyes. Somebody's already watching us. Court. Clara didn't answer straight. You knew. I suspected. Thomas came back to the table and sat heavy. He came on 2 months ago. Good hand with cattle kept to himself. But there's a rider comes through every Thursday, calls himself a horse trader, never buys a horse. And Court's always the one goes out to talk to him. He rubbed his jaw. I told myself it was nothing. It's not nothing. Clara gathered the 2 piles and stood. Here's what we do. Everything real goes where no one thinks to look, and it's not this house. Everything false, the doubled charges, the fake fees, I copy out fair in my own hand, and those copies stay in a drawer in the pantry where a snoop can find them. She almost smiled. Let him steal the parts that don't matter. Let Holloway spend a week thinking he knows what we know. Meanwhile, the forged note, the one that hangs him, that one never leaves my person. It rides in my apron till it's in front of a judge. Thomas looked at her a long moment. You've done this before. No, Clara said. I've had it done to me. That's better. A man who's been robbed remembers every trick because every trick left a scar. She tucked the forged note flat against her ribs under the apron over the place where her heart was going hard and steady. Now go on out there and be exactly the man you were yesterday. Tired, behind on your notes, scared of Holloway. If Court's watching, give him nothing to carry back, but the same sad story he's been carrying for 2 months. Can you do that? I've been that man for 2 years, Thomas said. Reckon I can manage 2 weeks. He went, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen, with a forger's confession against her heart, and for the first time she let herself feel the true size of what she'd walked into, and it did not frighten her the way it should have. It steadied her. She had been given at long last a wrong she could win. She found her opening with Court 3 days later, and she did it over pie. She'd baked 2 dried apple pies that afternoon, and she carried one out to the men at the noon break and set it down and cut it, and when the plates were empty, she looked down the table and said, easy as anything. Court, there's a second one back in the pantry cooling. You've got long arms. Fetch it in for me. He went. And Clara counted slow in her head, and at the count of 40, she wiped her hands and followed, and she came into the pantry to find Court Mabry standing at the open drawer with her fair-copied papers in his hand. He froze. That's the account, Clara said mild. Boss asked me to make a clean copy of what we owe. Sorry state, ain't it? Court's face did a whole day's work in 1 second, guilt and fear, and then a hard, flat mask pulled down over both. Wasn't reading it, he said. Drawer was open. I was looking for the pie tin. Pie's on the shelf right where I said. Clara held out her hand. Not for the papers. Just held it out open the way you'd offer it to a spooked horse. How much does he have on you? Court's jaw locked. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Clara pulled the stool over and sat, so she wasn't standing over him, so it wasn't a cornering. A man doesn't sell out a good outfit for the fun of it. Holloway's got a hook in you, same as he's got one in this ranch. So I'll ask plain, and you can lie to me if you want, but I'll know. What does he hold? For a long moment, she thought he'd bolt. Then, something in the young man's shoulders came down, and he set the papers on the shelf, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough. My brother, Court said. Micah, he's got a spread down on the Judith. Holloway holds his paper. 2 years back he told me if I hired on here and told him what Caldwell was up to month by month, he'd go easy on Micah when the note came due. His hands were fists. And if I didn't, he'd call it all at once and put my brother's family in the road. Micah's got 3 little ones and a wife that's poorly. He looked up and there was misery in it, real misery. I ain't proud of it, ma'am. I've hated every Thursday of it. But I got a brother. And Clara, who had stood in a doorway and lost everything to that same soft voice, felt the anger drain out of her all at once because she knew exactly the shape of the trap Court was standing in. It was the shape of her own. Micah's paper, she said. Is it forged too, do you reckon? Or honest? Court blinked. Honest, far as I know. He borrowed real money. Then he's better off than we are, and worse. Better because a real debt can be paid. Worse because a real debt gives Holloway a lever he doesn't even have to lie to pull. Clara stood. I'm not going to tell the boss about Thursdays. Not yet, because you're going to keep them. Court stared. You want me to keep spying? I want you to keep meeting that traitor, Clara said. And I want you to tell him exactly what I tell you to tell him. Holloway thinks he's got an ear in this outfit. He's about to find out he's got a mouth, and the mouth answers to me. She fixed him with a look. You do this right, Court Mabry, and when the day comes I'll see your brother's note is honest to the penny and paid down fair. Holloway won't have a thing left to hold over you. But you cross me, you carry one true word back to that man, and I'll let the boss deal with you. And Thomas Caldwell is a patient man right up until he isn't. Do we understand each other? Court was quiet a long time. Then he nodded once, and something eased in him, the look of a man who's been carrying a stone uphill for 2 years and just found somebody willing to take the other end. "What do I tell him Thursday?" he asked. Clara smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "Tell him Caldwell's given up. Tell him the widow he hired to cook is nothing but a cook, eats too much and knows too little, and the boss is broke and beat and ready to sell for whatever's offered. Tell him Black River's a ripe apple ready to fall." She turned for the door. "Let him come out here in 12 days, fat and easy and certain. A certain man doesn't check his own signatures." Thursday came, and Court rode out to the crossroads at noon, like he'd done every Thursday for 2 months, and this time Clara sent Toby up into the cottonwoods above the road, with instructions to watch and remember and say nothing. The horse trader was waiting, a lean man on a good horse, no string of horses anywhere in sight. "Well," the trader said, "what's Caldwell up to?" "Nothing," Court said, easy bored the way Clara had drilled him. "He's whipped. Prices killed him same as they killed everybody. He sits in that house half the day, hired some fat widow to cook, and she eats more than she makes, and that's the sum of the excitement out at Black River." He spat. "Man's ready to sell for whatever your Mr. Holloway offers him. He knows it's coming. He's just waiting on the 25th like a steer waits on the chute." The trader smiled, and it was an ugly thing. "Good. Mr. Holloway likes a man knows when he's beat. Saves everybody grief." He gathered his reins, then paused. "Between you and me, Caldwell's got no more chance than a snowball. Even if he took a mind to fight it, Holloway's got Judge Pardee in his pocket clear up to the elbow. Pardee's ruled his way 11 times running. There ain't a court in this territory'll cross Richard Holloway." He winked. "So tell your boss to sit tight. And you'll want to be somewhere else the next few nights, I'd say. Mr. Holloway don't like loose ends left lying around before a sale." And he rode off, and Court sat his horse cold all over, because he'd heard the thing under the thing, same as Clara had taught him to, and he lit out for the ranch at a dead run. "He's bought the judge," Court said, tumbling off his horse in the yard. "Pardee. The trader as good as said it, 11 rulings running, ain't a court in the territory'll go against him. And he told me to sleep somewhere else the next few nights. Ma'am, he told me to be gone." His face was gray. "He's fixing to do something before the 25th. Something he don't want witnesses to." Clara had gone very still over the stew pot. Then she set down the spoon. "Of course he bought the judge," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That's why Amos lost. That's why nobody ever beats him. It was never the figures that whipped them. It was Pardee." She looked up, and there was no fear in her, only that deep cold light. "Then we don't fight him in a territorial court. We go over the judge's head entirely straight to a federal marshal on a federal crime, and there's no county judge on this earth that can bury forgery and arson once a marshal from Helena's got the papers in his hand." She almost smiled. "He's just told us the one door that's locked, Court, which means every other door is open. Now go get warm. You did right." By the end of the first week, the whole outfit had, without a word being said, chosen a side. It happened the way weather happens, slow, and then all at once. Deke started taking his coffee in the kitchen of a morning and telling Clara things, old things, ranch things, who Holloway had ruined and how. It was Deke who told her about the Dunmores. Amos Dunmore had 4,000 acres on the Flat Willow, Deke said, turning his cup in his hands. "Good grass, good man. Holloway held his paper 3 years, and then one dry summer he called it all at once, same as he's fixing to do here. Amos fought it, went to the territorial court and everything. He drank. Lost. Court said the figures were the figures. Amos took to drink, and his wife took the children back east, and last I heard he was breaking horses for wages on a spread he used to own outright." Deke set the cup down hard. "That's the man's method, ma'am. He don't just take the land. He takes the fight out of you first, so by the time you're standing in front of a judge, you're already whipped, and a whipped man makes a poor witness." Clara had gone still over the stove. "Amos Dunmore, is he still on the Flat Willow?" "Far as I know, sleeping in a bunkhouse where his own bed used to be." "And do you reckon," Clara said slowly, that if Amos Dunmore's paper was worked the same as this one, he never knew to look for a forged signature because he had no bookkeeper to tell him what to look for. Deke looked at her a long moment. "You're saying his ruin might be sitting in a box somewhere, too. Proof of the same crime." "I'm saying," Clara said, "that a man who forges one signature has forged 50. A trick that works, he uses again. Somewhere in a courthouse or a bank vault, or Amos Dunmore's own broken hands, there's a note with a T that leans the wrong way." She turned the bacon. "One forged note is a quarrel between two men. 10 forged notes from 10 different ranches is a pattern. And a pattern, Deke, is the kind of thing that brings a federal marshal out of Helena, and a federal marshal doesn't shake Richard Holloway's hand and thank him for his patience." Deke was quiet. Then he stood and reached for his hat and settled it on his head. "Flat Willow's a day's ride," he said. "I've got Sunday free." "Take Toby," Clara said, "and take a pie. Amos Dunmore hasn't had a decent meal in 3 years from the sound of him, and a man remembers who fed him. Tell him the widow from Culpeper sends it, and tell him she believes him, because she's the only soul in the territory that's read the same lie he lost his land to. That'll bring him." It brought him. Deke rode back Sunday night with Amos Dunmore's papers wrapped in oilcloth and Amos Dunmore himself sitting a borrowed horse behind him. And the man who climbed down in the yard was gray and stooped and smelled of old whiskey. But his eyes came up sharp when Clara stepped out on the porch. "They tell me," Amos said, "there's a woman here says the court was wrong." "The court wasn't wrong," Clara said. "The court was lied to. There's a difference, and the difference is a signature that leans the wrong way. Come in, Mr. Dunmore. There's stew, and there's coffee, and there's a table. And on that table, I'm going to show you exactly how a man stole 4,000 acres out from under you. And then, you and I are going to decide what to do about it." Amos Dunmore stood in the yard a long moment. Then he took off his hat, the way a man does in church, and he came up the steps, and Clara saw that his hands were shaking, and not from the whiskey. She spread his papers next to Thomas's that night, the honest and the false in their 2 piles, and she found it inside the hour, the same phantom fees, the same doubled interest, and there on a note dated to a week, Amos swore on his children he'd been laid up with a broke leg 40 miles off the same careful, practiced lying hand. "That's his T," Clara said softly, laying the 2 forged notes side by side, Thomas's and Amos's. "Same forger, same year, 2 ranches 200 miles apart, one hand." She looked up, and her voice had gone quiet and terrible. "Gentlemen, we don't have a complaint. We have a conspiracy. And a conspiracy is a federal matter." Amos Dunmore put his face in his hands and wept, and no one at that table said a word. And Thomas Caldwell reached over and gripped the old man's shoulder, and Clara sat back and let the weight of it settle, because she understood something the men did not yet fully feel. This had stopped being about saving one ranch. This had become the thing Holloway feared more than any court in the world, the thing that had let him work in the open for years. It had become witnesses. It had become more than one. The trouble came on the 10th day, and it came as trouble does from the direction no one was watching. It was Toby who ran up from the lower pasture white as a sheet. "Boss," he gasped, "boss, the North herd. There's men down there with a bill of sale. They're cutting out 40 head. They say they're bought and paid for." Thomas was on his horse before the boy finished. Clara caught his stirrup. "Bring me their paper," she said. "Whatever they wave at you, don't argue. It don't fight it, bring me the paper. Paper's the only fight that counts now." He brought it. He came back an hour later, grim and mud-spattered, with a bill of sale in his fist, and he threw it on the table in front of her. "They're gone with the 40 head. Said the law was on their side. Said the paper was clean." His jaw was tight. "That's $1,000 of beef, Clara. Walking off my land in broad day with a receipt." Clara read it, and then she read it again slow, and a cold light came up in her face. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name without the mister, and neither of them noticed. "This bill of sale is dated 3 days from now." Silence. "What? Look." She held it out, her finger under the date. They were in such a hurry to get the 40 head off before Holloway rides out that they wrote the date wrong. This paper says you sold those cattle on the 18th. Today is the 15th. She set it down, and her hand was steady, and her voice was steadier. You can't sell a thing on a day that hasn't come yet. This isn't a bill of sale, Thomas. It's a confession, same as the note. It's a paper that proves Holloway's men took your cattle by force under a document forged so careless they got the day wrong. She looked up at him, and there was something fierce and bright in her face. He's rushing. He can smell the deadline. And a rushing man makes the mistakes a careful man never would. Thomas stared at the paper, and then at her, and then he laughed one short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, the first real laugh Clara had heard out of him. You're telling me they stole my cattle, he said, and handed me the rope to hang themselves with. I'm telling you, Clara said, that a man who's spent 2 years being patient with a spider forgets that a spider gets nervous too. Holloway thinks he's got till the 25th. He's moving pieces early, because somewhere in the back of his mind, he's afraid. He doesn't know what of, but I do. She stood and gathered the false bill of sale to the growing stack of Holloway's own crimes. It's me, Thomas. Somewhere he can't name it. He's afraid there's someone at Black River who can read, and he's right to be. That night late, when the house had gone quiet, and Amos was snoring in the spare room, and the men were long abed, Thomas found Clara still at the kitchen table by one low lamp, and he set 2 cups down and poured coffee into both, and he sat across from her the way he had that first night. You should sleep, he said. So should you. I don't sleep much, haven't in 5 years. He turned the cup. You want to know something I never told a living soul? When Eleanor died, I didn't grieve her not right off. I got angry. Angry at her for leaving, angry at the doctor, angry at the ranch for still needing feeding when I didn't have it in me to feed anything. And I've been running this place mean and hard and alone for 5 years, because the running kept me from feeling the rest of it. He looked up. And then a woman kneels down in my road with her husband's ring in her hand. And inside a week, she's found me a reason to fight I didn't know I still had. I don't know what to make of that. Clara held her cup in both hands and did not answer for a while. I'll tell you what I make of it, she said finally. For 2 years I believed what Culpepper told me, that I was nothing but a large, sad widow that let herself go, that my mind didn't count and my hands didn't count, and the only thing anybody'd ever see was the size of me. I believed it so long I near starved to death on a road, rather than walk into one more town and be looked at. She set the cup down. And then a man on a horse asked me, could I cook for 2, and it turned out he was really asking, was there any use in me? And there was Thomas. There was more use in me than that whole town ever guessed. I just needed one soul to ask. She met his eyes. So don't you thank me for finding you a reason to fight. We found each other one. That's a different thing, and it's a better one. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lamp guttered. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote sang, and another answered it, and the old house settled around them. Clara, Thomas said quietly, don't. She said it gently, but she said it. Not now. Not with 4 days on the clock and a forger fixing to ride up my road. There'll be a right time to say a thing like that if it's true, and this isn't it. A woman that's been made a fool of once learns to make the man wait till the danger's past. If you still feel it when Holloway's beat, you tell me then, and I'll believe you. Feelings that come up in a fight, half of them are just the fight. She stood and gathered the lamp. But I'll tell you this much, so you've got something to fight toward. I'd not object to being asked, when the time's right. And she went up the stairs and left him sitting there in the dark, and Thomas Caldwell smiled to himself in a way he had not smiled in 5 years. The last blow before the reckoning fell on the 12th day, and it near undid everything. Clara woke before dawn to the smell of smoke, not stove smoke. She knew stove smoke the way she knew her own hands, and this was wrong, oily and thick, and she was down the stairs and out the back door in her nightdress before she'd finished waking. And what she saw stopped her heart. The pantry window glowed. Someone had put fire to the pantry, to the drawer, to the papers, and Clara understood in one sick instant that the false copies she'd left as bait had done exactly the job she'd meant them to do, right up until Holloway decided he'd rather burn the evidence than read it. "Fire!" she screamed. "The house is a fire! The outfit came pouring out of the bunkhouse. Deke first, then the others, and they had a bucket line off the trough before Clara had her wits back, and it was Court Mabry of all men who went straight through the smoke into the pantry and came out coughing with the drawer clutched to his chest, the false papers scorched but whole, and threw it down in the mud and went back in for the water himself. They saved the house. It was close, and the pantry was a black ruin, but they saved the house. And when the sun came up and the men stood soot-streaked and heaving in the gray light, Court Mabry came to Clara, where she stood in her scorched nightdress, and he held out something in his blackened hand. It was a boot print cut from the mud by the pantry window where the fire was set, traced onto a shingle. And a scrap of good gray coat cloth caught on a nail. "Town man's boot," Court said hoarsely. "And that's banker's cloth, ma'am. Not one hand here wears it." He looked at her, and there was no more spy in his face, none, only a man who'd made his choice and gone through fire to prove it. "He sent someone to burn you out, in the night, with the whole outfit sleeping." His voice shook. "My brother's note or no, I'm done carrying water for a man that'd burn a house with people in it. You tell me what you need. I'll ride to Helena myself." Clara looked at the boot print and the cloth, and the black ruin of the pantry, and the exhausted, soot-blind, furious men standing in her yard who had run into a burning building for a woman. Half of them had laughed at 12 days before. And she felt the last thing settle into place, the thing she'd been missing. The thing that turns a case into a conviction. "He didn't burn evidence," she said, and her voice carried across the whole silent yard. "He tried to. But every scrap that matters is right here." She pressed her hand flat against her own ribs, against the forged note that had never once left her apron that she'd worn even to bed. "It's been on my person for 12 days, and it'll be on my person till it's in a marshal's hand. All he burned was the bait." She turned and looked at every man in the yard, at Thomas, at Deke, at Amos Dunmore, leaning gray in the doorway, at Court Black to the elbows. "And he did us a kindness doing it, because arson, gentlemen, is a thing a marshal can see. Forgery, you have to read. But fire, a man can smell the fire from Helena." She lowered her hand. "Deke, Amos, get the papers, and the two of you ride for the territorial marshal at first light, and you don't stop till you're standing in front of him. Court, you keep your Thursday one last time, and you tell that traitor everything's fine. Everything's beat. Everything's ready to fall. Give Holloway his certainty for 4 more days." She drew a breath. "Because in 4 days, he's riding up my road to collect a ranch, and I mean for him to ride up easy and certain and slow, and I mean to be standing on that porch to meet him." See. Thomas came to stand beside her, soot on his face and something new and unbroken in his eyes. "And when he gets here," he said. Clara Whitmore looked down the road that Richard Holloway would ride up in 4 days' time. The same soft-voiced man who had smiled at her in a cold doorway and told her the bank does not make mistakes. And she felt no fear at all, only a deep and patient and terrible calm. "When he gets here," she said, "he's going to find out the widow can read." He rode up her road on the 25th just past noon, easy and slow, and certain exactly as she'd meant him to. Clara stood on the porch in a clean apron with her hands folded in front of her, and she watched Richard Holloway come, and he was smaller than she remembered, and softer than she remembered, and more terrible than she remembered all at once. He rode a fine bay horse, and wore a fine gray coat, and behind him came 2 men on lesser horses, big men who did not meet anyone's eyes, and Clara knew that kind of man too. They were the same kind that had stood in her doorway in Culpeper and looked at the floor while their master took her home. Thomas stood beside her, hat in his hands, shoulders down, looking every inch the beaten man they'd rehearsed. Deke was not in the yard. Amos was not in the yard. Only Court and Toby, and 2 other hands spread easy about their work, watching without seeming to. Holloway drew rein at the foot of the steps. He did not get down. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, warm as fresh bread. I'm glad to find you looking well. I'd feared this business had worn on you. It's worn on me, Thomas said dully. Of course it has. Of course it has. Holloway shook his head all sorrow. It's a cruel year, Thomas. The market broke a dozen good men better fixed than you. There's no shame in it. A man fights the weather, and the weather always wins in the end. He let that sit gentle as a hand on a shoulder. Which is why I've come myself. To spare you the indignity of the court. I've had the account reviewed top to bottom, and I'm afraid the balance stands at $3,140 due today. A small pause kindly. But I'm not a hard man, Thomas. I'll take the ranch, clear the land, and the stock, and the improvements, and I'll call the debt square, and I'll put $400 cash in your hand to start fresh somewhere. The memories don't hurt so much. That's more than the law requires of me. I'd like to think it's what one Christian owes another, and there it was. The whole trap sprung soft the way it had been sprung on Daniel, on Amos, on a dozen men before them. Buy the ranch for a tenth of its worth, call the theft a mercy, and ride off with another man's life folded in his coat. Thomas opened his mouth. He'll not sign a thing, Clara said. Holloway's eyes came to her for the first time, and she watched him place her slow, the way a man places a face he can't quite name. Then he had it, and something moved behind his soft face, something that was almost surprise and almost amusement. Why, he said. Mrs. Whitmore, from Culpeper. He smiled. I'd heard Caldwell hired a cook. I didn't imagine it was you. My butt, you've come up in the world. Kitchen work suits you. His eyes went over her, once deliberate, the old bottle-passing look, and he made sure she saw it. There's a good deal of you to suit. Court took a step forward off the corral rail. Clara stopped him with a hand she didn't even turn to raise. There is, she agreed pleasantly, a good deal of me, and every bit of it has spent the last 2 weeks reading your books, Mr. Holloway. Which is more than I can say for the poor souls you've robbed before on account of they never had a bookkeeper in the kitchen. The smile stayed on his mouth. It left his eyes. I don't know what you think you've read, Mrs. Whitmore, but I'd be careful. You made wild accusations once before in Culpeper, as I recall, in front of witnesses. It didn't go well for you then. His voice was still soft. That was the worst of it, how soft it stayed. A woman alone with a grievance and no proof is a sad thing. But a woman who repeats slander, she's already been warned off of why that's a woman asking for real trouble. I'd hate to see it, truly. I don't have a grievance, Clara said. She reached into her apron, and she drew out the forged note, and she held it up so the yard could see it, and her hand was steady as stone. I have this. Holloway's eyes went to the paper, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the softness slipped, and Clara saw underneath it the thing that had been under it all along, cold and quick and reptile flat, and then the soft mask came down again. A note, he said, signed by Mr. Caldwell. I fail to see how his own signature helps him. That's the trouble, Clara said. It isn't his own. She came down 1 step. This note's dated August of last year for $400. Mr. Caldwell was up in the high pasture 11 days that August after strays with 6 men who'll swear to it under oath. He didn't sign this, Mr. Holloway. Somebody sat down with 3 of his real signatures and practiced his hand and got it near perfect near, but they crossed his T too high because they didn't know that Thomas Caldwell crosses his T low the way his own schoolteacher beat into him 40 years back. She came down another step. You want to know how I know a forged signature at a glance, Mr. Holloway? Because I stood in a cold doorway 2 years ago, and you held one out to me and told me the bank does not make mistakes. And I've thought about that sentence every day since. The bank does not make mistakes. She was on the bottom step, now level with his horse. You were right. The bank doesn't make mistakes. The bank makes forgeries. There's a world of difference, and I aim to teach it to a federal marshal. The yard had gone dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold. Holloway sat his horse a long moment. Then he laughed soft and easy and shook his head as though at a child. A forgery, determined by a cook, from the way a T is crossed. He looked around the yard, taking in the men, spreading his hands. Gentlemen, you see how it is. A grieving woman, a desperate man, a wild story invented to escape an honest debt. It's sad, but it's common. Every man about to lose a ranch discovers a conspiracy the week before the note comes due. He gathered his reins. But you'll want a real judge to hear all this. Won't you, Mrs. Whitmore? As it happens, Judge Pardee holds court in Cottonwood on Thursday. Bring your note. Bring your crossed T's. I'm sure he'll give you every consideration. And the way he said the judge's name, easy and warm, was a threat, and everyone in that yard heard it land. I imagine he would, Clara said. 11 times running from what I hear. Holloway went still. It was a small thing. A flicker. But Clara had spent 2 years reading small things, and she watched the number land on him and watched him understand all at once that the widow in the apron knew about Pardee, and that a woman who knew about Pardee had not been talking only to herself. I don't know where you'd hear a thing like that, Holloway said, and the softness had gone thin, now stretched. You'd be surprised what a cook hears, Clara said. Men talk in a kitchen, and traders talk at crossroads. And the thing about buying a judge, Mr. Holloway, is that it's the one purchase a man can't fight you on. Which is exactly why I never intended to fight you in front of Judge Pardee. She folded the note back into her apron. I intend to fight you in front of the United States. That was when the sheriff came up the road. He came fast, 3 riders, and Clara felt Thomas tense beside her, because this was the piece they hadn't planned for. This was the wild card, and she made herself breathe slow. The sheriff was a heavy red-faced man named Bell, and he pulled up beside Holloway with the ease of a man pulling up beside his employer, and he didn't so much as look at Thomas before he looked at the banker. Got your word, Mr. Holloway, Bell said. What's the trouble? No trouble, Sheriff, no trouble at all. Holloway had his warmth back in an instant, and Clara saw how it worked. Now the whole ugly machine of it, how the softness was for the marks and the sheriff was for the muscle. A small matter of stolen property. 40 head of my cattle were taken off my care and driven onto this ranch some days ago. I have the bill of sale. I'd like them recovered, and I'd like the man responsible held to answer. And Sheriff Bell turned to Thomas Caldwell and said, 40 head of Mr. Holloway's beef, that true. They took 40 of my... Thomas started hot. His paper says otherwise. Bell was already swinging down thumbs in his belt. I got a signed bill of sale says those cattle are Holloway's, and I got them cattle standing in your pasture right now. That's theft, Caldwell. Get your hat. You'll answer for it in Cottonwood. The trap had turned inside out in the space of a minute. Clara saw it clear. Holloway had come with 2 knives, not one, the debt in his coat, and a stolen cattle charge in the sheriff's. And if the widow's forgery story wouldn't stick, the sheriff's cuffs would, and either way, Thomas Caldwell would spend the next weeks in a Cottonwood jail with Holloway's judge across the room, and no one to run the ranch, and no one to protect the papers. Sheriff, Clara said, may I see that bill of sale? You may not. This is men's business. Then I'll speak it aloud and you can tell me I'm wrong. Clara came fully off the steps now and stood in the dust of her own yard, and she raised her voice so every soul could hear. Mr. Holloway's bill of sale for those 40 head is dated the 18th of this month. Am I right, Mr. Holloway? Go on. You've got a copy. Read us the date. Holloway said nothing. The 18th, Clara went on. But his men drove those cattle off this land on the 15th, in broad day. In front of Toby there, and 2 other hands, and Mr. Caldwell himself, all of whom will swear the day. She turned to the sheriff. Now, Sheriff Bell, you're a lawman. So you'll know a man can't sell a thing 3 days before he takes it. This bill of sale is dated for a day that hadn't happened yet when the cattle were already gone, which means it was written after the fact to paper over a theft and written so careless they got the date wrong. That's not Mr. Caldwell's crime, Sheriff. That's Mr. Holloway's, and it's the second forged document I can lay on a table today, and you're standing real close to a man who's fixing to need a lawyer of his own. Sheriff Bell's red face had gone still. He looked at Holloway. He looked at the paper he hadn't read closely. And Clara watched a slow, ugly doubt work its way through the man, the doubt of a bought lawman, starting to wonder if he'd been sold a bad horse. "Sheriff," Holloway said, and his voice had an edge in it now, the softness cracking at last. "The woman is a known liar. She was run out of Culpeper for it. Do your job." "Run out for what?" Clara said. "Say it plain, Mr. Holloway. Tell the sheriff what I was run out of Culpeper for. Was it lying? Or was it standing in my own doorway with my dead husband 3 months in the ground telling you the figures in your book were wrong? Because those are two different things, and the whole difference between them is whether you're a robbed widow or a liar, and you'd know because you're the man that decided which one I'd be. That's enough." Holloway's voice cracked all the way now, and for the first time the soft banker was gone, and the thing underneath stood bare in the noon light. He jabbed a finger at Court. You're the Mabry boy. Micah Mabry's brother. You'll want to remember your brother's got a note with me, boy, a real one. And it comes due in November. And it'd be a shame if it came due all at once with 3 children in the house. So you'll keep your mouth shut, and you'll tell this sheriff the truth that Caldwell stole my cattle or your brother's in the road by Christmas. You hear me?" The yard went silent. And Court Mabry, black-eyed and pale, looked at the man who'd owned him for 2 years, and then he looked at Clara, and then he looked at Sheriff Bell. "You all heard that," Court said, and his voice shook, but it did not break. "You all heard him threaten to put a man's children in the road unless I lie for him. Sheriff, you heard it? That's a banker offering to ruin an honest note as a bribe for false witness, right here out loud in front of a dozen men." He took off his hat and held it in both hands the way you do at a graveside. "I've been carrying that man's water 2 years to keep my brother safe, and I'm done. I set his fires. No, ma'am, I never, but I carried his messages, and I'm telling it all to a marshal, to God, to whoever'll write it down. Micah's better off ruined and honest than saved by me lying for that snake." Something broke open in Clara's chest, hot and proud, but she kept her face still, because it wasn't finished, because the sheriff still had his thumbs in his belt, and a bought judge still held court in Cottonwood, and one brave man's word was not yet enough to hang Richard Holloway. "He set the fire," Amos Dunmore said. He'd come around the corner of the house, and he was not gray and stooped. Now he stood straight, and he had oilcloth-wrapped papers under his arm, and behind him, walking easy, was a lean, dust-covered man with a star on his coat and a Winchester in the crook of his elbow, and behind that man rode Deke. "Amos Dunmore," Holloway said, and the name came out of him wrong, strangled. "You remember me." Amos came into the yard. 4,000 acres on the Flatwillow. 3 years back you called my note all at once, and Pardee ruled me off it, and I've broke horses on my own land for wages ever since. And all that time I thought I'd just been a fool who couldn't do sums." He held up the oilcloth. "Till a widow in a kitchen taught me to look at how a man crosses his T. My note's forged to Holloway. Same hand as Caldwell's. Same year. I got it right here, and I got a marshal beside me who's been listening to every word you've said since you named that boy's brother." The lawman with the star swung down off his horse. "United States Marshal," he said unhurried. "Name's Aldous Reed out of Helena. 2 men rode into my office 3 days back with a story about forged banknotes across half this territory, and a burned pantry, and a judge that never rules but one way." He looked up at Holloway, and his eyes were flat and pale and patient. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Holloway. I get a story like that once a month, and most of them are just a broke rancher's dream. So I came out to see for myself. Figured if it was smoke, I'd have a ride in the country, and no harm done." He hooked a thumb in his belt. "But I've been sitting my horse behind that barn the last 10 minutes, mister, and I heard you offer to put a man's children in the road for false witness with my own 2 ears. That's suborning perjury and extortion, and it don't need a crossed T to prove it. It just needs a marshal in the right spot at the right time." A thin smile. "Which I was." Holloway's face had gone the color of old ash. "This is absurd," he said, and his voice was climbing now, losing its bottom. "I am a banker. I hold legitimate notes. Judge Pardee has ruled on these matters a dozen times." "Judge Pardee," said Marshal Reed, "is a territorial judge. I'm a federal officer. Forgery of instruments and mail fraud and conspiracy across county lines, Don't stop at Party's courtroom door, and neither do I." He nodded to the papers under Amos's arm to the note in Clara's apron. "Now, I'm told there's a lady here can lay it all out for me, figure by figure, so a jury in Helena can follow it. That true, ma'am?" "It's true," Clara said. Holloway made one last grab at solid ground. "She forged them," he cried, and his voice went high and thin as a boy's. "Marshall, use your head. A bookkeeper, a woman with a grudge 2 years deep, run out of Culpeper hating me. She wrote those notes herself to frame an honest man. Who else in that yard could forge a signature but her? Ask her. Ask the forger to prove she isn't one." For one breath, the accusation hung there, and Clara saw it work on Sheriff Bell's face. Saw the doubt swing back, because it was clever. It was the kind of clever that had kept Holloway free for years, turning his own crime around, and pinning it on the one person who could read it. "Marshall," Clara said calmly, "hand me Mr. Caldwell's forged note and Mr. Dunmore's both, and let me stand 10 feet off while you hold them so no man can say I touched a thing." Reed did it. "Now look at the ink. Caldwell's note is dated last August, Dunmore's 3 years back. Hold them to the light. That ink's aged brown, sunk into the fiber, a year and more of it. I've had these papers 3 weeks. You can't age ink 3 years and 3 weeks, sir. No soul alive can. It's the one thing in this whole business a body can't fake." She never moved closer. "And the paper. Turn Dunmore's over. There's a watermark, a little rider on a horse. That's the Cottonwood Bank's own stock. Marshall, Holloway's own paper ordered special from St. Louis. I'd stake my life a stationer can prove it. Now how would a Culpeper widow with a borrowed apron come by 3-year-old ink on the Cottonwood Bank's private paper, unless the man who owns the bank put it there himself?" She looked at Holloway, and her voice never rose. "You want to call me the forger? Go ahead. But you'll have to explain how I forged your own watermark 3 years before I ever laid eyes on this ranch. I'll wait." Holloway had no answer. There was none to have. And Marshall Reed turned the papers to the light and studied the aged brown ink and the little watermarked rider, and gave a slow nod, and that nod was the last nail, and every man in the yard heard it go in. Suborning, perjury, extortion, forgery, and now false accusation of a witness in front of a federal officer. Reed said dryly, folding the papers away careful. "Mister, you are the most industrious criminal I have met in 20 years. Bell, choose." Sheriff Bell took his hands off his belt, real slow, and stepped back from Holloway's horse, and did not say one word. And in that single backward step, the whole machine that had ground down Culpeper and the Flat Willow and a dozen ranches besides came quietly apart. Holloway saw it come apart. Clara watched him see it, and she watched the soft mask fall away for good, and the thing that had lived behind it his whole life stand naked in her yard, and it was not clever, and it was not patient, and it was not a spider. It was just a small, cruel, frightened man who had never once in his life been told no by someone he couldn't ruin. "You?" he said to Clara, and his voice was low and shaking and full of hate. "You fat, sad, ruined woman. You had nothing. You had nothing when I put you off that land, and you have nothing now, a borrowed apron and a beggar's story, and you think you've beaten me. I have made and broken men from Helena to the river. Do you have any idea what I am?" And Clara Whitmore, who had knelt in the dust of this same yard 3 weeks before, with her dead husband's ring held out in a shaking hand, looked up at the man who had buried her, and she was not shaking now. "I know exactly what you are," she said. "You're a man who thought a woman was only worth what he could see of her. My town thought the same. They looked at me and saw a large, sad widow, and decided that was the whole of me, and they were wrong, Mr. Holloway, and it cost them nothing, because I only walked away. But you looked at me and decided the same thing, and you didn't walk away. You handed me your books." She stepped closer, close enough to touch the bay's shoulder, and she did not raise her voice, and it carried to every corner of that silent yard. "That's your one mistake, and it's the only one that ever mattered. You spent your whole life sure that nobody was worth reading twice, and I am the second reading, Mr. Holloway. I am every figure you thought no one would ever check come to call at last." For a moment, Richard Holloway said nothing. Then, quicker than a soft man should have moved his hand, went inside his fine gray coat. "Gun!" Court shouted. But Thomas Caldwell was already moving. He'd stood beaten and quiet through the whole of it, hat in his hands, playing the whipped man clear to the end, and Clara understood in one blazing instant that some part of him had been waiting for exactly this, coiled the whole time, because a man does not run into a burning building or ride out after strays for 11 days without something hard and fast underneath the quiet. He was up the last step and between Clara and the horse before the pistol cleared the coat, and he caught Holloway's wrist in one brown fist and twisted, and the little pistol went off once into the dirt and then fell, and Thomas hauled the banker clean off his fine bay horse and put him down in the dust of the yard he'd come to steal, and knelt on him and did not hit him, though every man there could see how badly he wanted to. "That's assault on a peace officer's arrest," Marshal Reed observed mildly, picking up the fallen pistol, "and attempted murder before witnesses on top of the rest. Mr. Holloway, I'd about given up hope you'd hang yourself any higher, but you keep finding ways." He nodded to Thomas. "You can let him up, Mr. Caldwell. He's not going anywhere but Helena, and he's going in irons." Thomas rose slow, breathing hard, and stepped back and stood beside Clara, and neither of them touched the other. But Clara felt the whole length of his arm warm against hers, and neither of them moved away. They put Holloway in irons in the middle of the yard. His two big men had already melted back toward the road, wanting no part of a federal charge, and the sheriff sat his horse gray-faced and silent, a man measuring the wreck of his own arrangements. And Richard Holloway, who had ridden up that road at noon, soft and certain and sure, sat in the dust with iron on his wrists and looked up at the woman in the borrowed apron, and for the first time in his life found he had nothing left to threaten her with. "Marshal," Clara said, "before you take him, there's a boy's brother, Micah Mabry, holds an honest note with this man's bank. And there's Amos Dunmore's 4,000 acres taken on a forged paper. And there's a dozen more, I'd guess, in a vault in Cottonwood, every one of them a family that thought they were just fools who couldn't do sums." She rested her hand flat against the note in her apron, the forged note the first thread of the whole unraveling. "I kept books 8 years. Give me the run of that vault and a week, and I'll hand you every family this man ever robbed, named and dated, and proved so. Not one of them has to spend another night believing the fault was theirs." Marshal Reed looked at her a long moment, the way men had been learning to look at Clara Whitmore for 3 weeks now, like a thing badly underestimated. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe I'll do exactly that." He hauled Holloway up by the chain and steered him toward a horse. "In 20 years of this work, I've learned there's 2 kinds of people bring me a case. Most bring me their anger, and anger's no good in a courtroom, it just makes a witness look wild." He set the banker in the saddle, none too gentle. "You brought me arithmetic. Arithmetic hangs a man that anger never could." He touched his hat brim. "You'd have made a hell of a marshal, Mrs. Whitmore, if the territory had the sense to let a woman wear the star." And then they were riding out, the marshal and Deke and the chained banker and the gray silent sheriff behind, down the same road. Holloway had come up soft and certain not an hour before, and the whole outfit stood in the yard and watched them go, and no man cheered because it was too big for cheering. They just stood and watched the dust of it until the last of it was gone. It was Toby, of all of them, who broke first. The boy sat down right there in the dirt where he'd been standing and put his face in his hands, and Clara went to him and knelt, groaning a little at the knees, and put her arm around the boy's thin, shaking shoulders. "He's really gone," Toby said into his hands. "For good. He can't come back and take it." "He can't come back," Clara said. "Not this time. This time it's written down and it's dated and it's proved, and there's a marshal from Helena carrying it, and no soft voice on earth is going to smile it away." She squeezed the boy. "You did a brave thing watching that crossroads for me. You want to know the truth, Toby, this ranch owes as much to your 2 eyes in a cottonwood tree as it does to anything I ever wrote on paper. Don't you forget that." The boy wiped his face and nodded, and Clara helped him up, and when she straightened, she found the whole yard looking at her. Deke gone, but the others there, Court and the Hands and Amos Dunmore standing straighter than he had in 3 years. All of them looking at the large widow. They'd have laughed off the road 3 weeks before, and there was not one grain of the old bottle-passing look anywhere in that yard. There was only something quieter and better, the thing a person spends a whole life hoping just once to be looked at with. There was respect. Thomas came and stood in front of her, and turned his hat in his hands, and for a man who'd just hauled a would-be killer off a horse, he looked suddenly and completely at a loss. "Clara," he said, "don't." But she was smiling when she said it, and it was not the hard smile from the porch. It was something new and unguarded that she hadn't worn in years and had half forgotten she owned. "You made me a promise, Thomas Caldwell. You said you'd wait till the danger was past." Thomas looked down the empty road where the dust of Richard Holloway had finally settled, and then back at the woman standing in the middle of his yard, the woman who had walked up this road with everything she owned in a bag, and had in 3 weeks given him back a ranch, a reason, and something he'd buried 5 years deep, and thought he'd never feel again. "Clara," he said, "how much longer?" And his voice was rough. "How much longer does the danger have to be past?" And Clara Whitmore, who had promised herself on a lonesome road that she was done crying, where men could see, felt her eyes fill right there in the noon light in front of the whole outfit, and for once in her life, she did not care one bit who saw. "Not yet," Clara said, and she wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and laughed at herself for the wiping. "Lord, look at me, not yet, Thomas. And don't you look wounded, because I'm going to tell you why, and the why is the best thing I've said to you yet." She caught his rough hand in both of hers, right there in the yard the first time she'd touched him on purpose. "There's a vault in Cottonwood full of families that think they were fools. Amos thought it 3 years. I thought it too. There's a boy's brother down on the Judith about to lose everything on an honest note that a wicked man means to call cruel. I can fix all of it, Thomas. Every name in that vault, but not from a wedding, from a ledger." She squeezed his hand. "So you ask me again when they're free, when the last stolen acres handed back and the last widow knows the fault was never hers. You ask me then, and I promise you the answer. But I'd not have you marry a woman who left work half done to do it. You wouldn't respect her by spring, and I couldn't bear it." Thomas looked at her a long moment, and then he did a thing that undid her more than any answer could have. He lifted her hand, the plain, broad, work-reddened hand that had scrubbed his stove and turned his books, and held out a dead man's ring in this same dust 3 weeks gone, and he pressed his mouth to the back of it gentle, the way a man kisses a thing he's decided is holy. "Then go finish your work, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I've waited 5 years to feel like this. I reckon I can wait out a ledger." The vault in Cottonwood took her 9 days, not the 7 she'd promised. It took 9 days because it was worse than she'd guessed, and Clara had guessed bad. Marshall Reed cleared the bank and stood a deputy at the door and let her work. And she worked the way she'd worked that first night at Black River, one paper at a time, patient as winter. And what came up out of that vault made even Reed go quiet. 41 families, she told him on the 3rd day, her hand cramped around the pencil ledger sheets, spread the length of the banker's own desk. 41 that I've found so far over 11 years. Some he ruined outright, land and all. Some he's still bleeding a little every season, waiting on their bad year. Ranches, a sawmill, 2 mercantiles, a widow's boarding house in Cottonwood. She tapped the sheets. It's all one hand doing the forging, Marshall. Same tea, same flourish, 11 years of it. He didn't do this alone. A man that busy has a clerk. The clerk's name was Merritt Sloan, and he was a thin, nervous man of 40 who'd kept Holloway's books in the back room for 9 years, and when Reed brought him in and sat him across from Clara, she did not raise her voice, and she did not accuse him. She slid one forged note across the table and set her own honest hand of writing beside it. "That's your work, Mr. Sloan," she said quietly. "I can tell a man's hand the way you can tell his walk. You cross a foreign T. You loop your L's high. You've been forging these 11 years for a man who paid you a clerk's wage to do a hangman's work, and I'll tell you the truth now plain, because I've been where you're sitting." She leaned in. "He'll let you hang for it. Men like Holloway always do. The moment it costs him nothing, he'll swear he never knew that his clerk did it all behind his back, and there's your forged notes in your own hand to prove his story. You'll swing, and he'll walk unless. Sloane's face had gone the color of paper. Unless what? Unless you tell a federal marshal everything in your own words before Holloway's lawyer thinks to blame you. Who ordered which note? When? What you were paid? Where the money went? Clara sat back. You did a wicked thing, Mr. Sloane, 11 years of wicked things, and I won't pretend otherwise. But there's 41 families out there think they were fools, and you can hand them back the truth. That won't wash you clean. Nothing washes a man clean of this. But it'll let you sleep maybe some nights knowing you undid a little of what you did. She stood. Marshal Reed's got paper and a pen. I'll leave you to it. Merritt Sloane wept for a while the way men weep when a thing they've carried too long is finally set down. And then he talked for 6 hours, and Reed wrote it all, and when Sloane got to the 5th year of it, he said a name that made Clara's pencil stop. And the judge, Sloane said, Pardee. He took $200 a ruling. It's in the book. Mr. Holloway wrote it as legal fees. But it was Pardee every man he ruled off his land. Pardee got $200. It's there. Page after page of it. Clara found the pages, and there it was. 11 years of a bought judge written down in a banker's own bragging hand, because Richard Holloway had grown so sure no one would ever read his books that he'd kept the receipts of his own corruption. Marshal Reed looked at the pages a long time, and then he folded them careful, and there was something in his face Clara hadn't seen before, a hard, cold satisfaction. Mrs. Whitmore. He said, You didn't just bring me a banker, you brought me a judge. There's men in Helena been trying to reach Pardee for 6 years. He tucked the pages away. I'd near forgotten a case could feel this good. It was on the 7th day, deep in the older ledgers, the ones from 3 years back, and further, that Clara found the thing she had not let herself hope for. She found Daniel. She found her own farm. Her own quarter section, at the edge of the Culpeper Valley, entered in Holloway's hand, and there beside it, the note that had put her off it. And she knew, before she checked, she knew in her stomach, before her eyes confirmed it, that the tea would lean the wrong way. It did. Daniel Whitmore's signature, the signature of a gentle, laughing man, 4 months dead of fever, forged by Merritt Sloane's foreign hand on a debt near twice what her honest books had ever shown. Clara sat very still in the empty bank with the ledger open in front of her, and she did not cry, and she did not shake. She had cried already 2 years of it. This was past crying. This was the thing she'd needed since the day they put her off that land. The thing she'd told Amos Dunmore about, without ever letting herself believe she'd have it for her own. Proof, written down, dated, impossible to smile away. She had not been a fool. She had not misremembered. Grief had not muddled her recollection. The figures had been wrong because a man had made them wrong, and she had been right the whole time. Right in the cold doorway with the wind cutting through her thin black dress. Right when the whole town turned its porches to her right, when she'd walked north sooner than eat one more meal among people who'd decided what she was by looking. Right. Marshal Reed found her there an hour later, still sitting, the ledger open, her hand flat on the page. Ma'am, he said, you've been in here since dawn. You all right? That's my husband, Clara said. She didn't look up. That's my farm. He forged Daniel's hand, same as he forged Caldwell's. I've been reading 41 people's ruin for a week and telling every one of them the fault was never theirs, and I never once let myself believe I'd find my own. She looked up then, and her eyes were dry and very bright. It wasn't my fault either, Marshal. I've known it 2 years and believed it about 3 minutes ago. There's a difference between knowing and believing. I only just now learned how wide it is. Reed took off his hat. He was not a soft man, but he stood there bareheaded in Richard Holloway's looted bank, and he said, No, ma'am, it surely wasn't your fault. And when this goes before a jury, you're going to be the one that tells the whole territory so. She rode back to Black River on the 9th day, with the case wrapped in oilcloth and something loosened in her chest that had been knotted tight for 2 years, and Thomas met her in the yard, and he took one look at her face and knew something had changed, though he didn't yet know what. You found something, he said. I found everything. She swung down stiff from the ride. 41 families, Thomas. A clerk that's confessed, and the judge party took 200 a ruling, and Holloway wrote it down like a proud fool. She stood in front of him. And I found my Daniels note. Forged. My farm too. I wasn't wrong, Thomas. 2 years I half believed the town that I'd let grief scramble my sums, and I was right the whole time, and now I can prove it in front of God and a jury. And Thomas Caldwell, who was not a man given to display, put both arms around Clara Whitmore right there in the yard and held her, and she let him, and neither of them said a word for a good while. "You get your farm back," he said at last into her hair. "I get my farm back." He went still, just slightly, and Clara felt it, and she understood it, and it near broke her heart with tenderness because the man was thinking she might leave, might take her vindicated land and her cleared name and go home to Culpeper, and he was too decent to say so and too proud to ask. "Don't you fret about that now," she said, and stepped back so she could see his face. "We've got a trial to win first. A man doesn't count his herd in a blizzard." But she said it gentle, and she let her hand rest a moment on his chest before she went in, and Thomas Caldwell watched her go and let himself hope. The trial was held in Helena in the fall before a federal judge who had never once shaken Richard Holloway's hand, and it drew a crowd because a bought territorial judge in the dock was a thing men rode 100 miles to see. Holloway had a lawyer down from the capital, a smooth, silver-headed man named Prentice, who charged more in a day than Court Mabry made in a season. And Prentice had exactly one strategy, and Clara had known from the first he would, because it was the only one Holloway's kind ever had. He went after her. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prentice said, silky pacing before the jury box. "You cook, for a living, on a cattle ranch." "I do. And before that you were what a farmer's wife. You've no legal training, no formal accounting, no education past a country schoolhouse." "That's right. And yet you'd have this jury believe that you, a widowed ranch cook, uncovered an 11-year criminal conspiracy that escaped every banker, lawyer, and judge in the territory, simply by looking at how a letter T is crossed." Prentice smiled at the jury. "You'll forgive me, ma'am. It strains a reasonable man's belief." "It does." Clara agreed, and the agreement threw him. She saw it throw him. "It strained mine too. Mr. Prentice, the first time I saw it done in a cold doorway 2 years ago. A reasonable man can't believe a banker would forge because a reasonable man's never been robbed by one. That's exactly what Mr. Holloway counted on. He counted on 11 years of reasonable men saying just what you're saying, that it can't be that a cook can't have caught what a judge missed." She folded her hands. "But I'd point out to you, sir, that I didn't ask this jury to believe me. I asked them to look. The ink's aged, or it isn't. The watermark's the bank's own stock, or it isn't. Mr. Caldwell was in the high pasture that August, or he wasn't, and 6 men have sworn he was. I'm not asking anyone to trust the cook, Mr. Prentice. I'm asking them to check the arithmetic. That's the one thing in the world that doesn't care who does the checking." A low sound went through the courtroom, and Prentice's smile got thin, and Clara knew she had him because a lawyer whose whole case is that the witness is too lowly to be believed has no answer when the witness says, "Believe the paper, not me." "Let's talk about your motive," Prentice tried. "You hate my client. He foreclosed on your farm. You've carried a grudge 2 years. Isn't it possible, Mrs. Whitmore, that a grieving, resentful woman—" "Mr. Prentice." Clara's voice cut through him, quiet and flat. "You want the jury to believe I hated your client so bad I invented all this to ruin him. But you've got it backwards, and I'll tell you how. I didn't come looking for Richard Holloway. I was walking north to starve honest sooner than be looked at one more time in a town that had made up its mind about me. I didn't know whose ranch I'd knelt down at. I found his crime in a ledger stuffed behind a flour barrel by accident on my first night before I knew he had one thing to do with the man who'd hired me." She turned to face the jury full on. "A woman who wanted revenge would have come hunting. I came running away. I stumbled onto the truth backing up. And if you want to talk about my grudge, sir, then let's, because 2 years ago, your client stood in my doorway and told me grief had muddled a woman's recollection. And I have spent every day since believing maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a foolish fat widow who couldn't do her sums." Her voice never rose, and the whole room had gone dead silent. And last month I found my dead husband's forged signature in your client's own vault in his own clerk's hand, and I learned I'd been right the whole time. So yes, Mr. Prentice, I've got a grudge. I earned it honest. But a grudge doesn't age ink, and it doesn't forge a bank's own watermark, and it doesn't write a judge's bribes down in a ledger. Your client did all that himself. Ask him. Prentice did not ask him. Merritt Sloan testified for 2 hours in his thin, shaking voice and named every note, and Holloway sat gray and shrunken, and no longer soft at all, while his own clerk unspooled 11 years of his crimes. Amos Dunmore testified straight-backed about 4,000 acres and a broke leg, and 3 years of breaking horses on land he'd owned outright. Court Mabry testified about Thursdays at a crossroads and a brother on the Judith. And when the ledger pages with Pardee's name were entered into evidence, a marshal walked across the room and put a hand on the shoulder of a man who had ruled the territory for 6 years and led him out, and the crowd was so quiet you could hear the floorboards. It was Prentice's last mistake to put Holloway on the stand himself. He did it because he had nothing left, and a lawyer with nothing left will sometimes gamble on his client's tongue, and it is nearly always a losing bet. Holloway was smooth for a while. He was a banker. He said a servant of the territory, a man who lent money to the hopeful and could not be blamed when hope ran out. He had never forged a thing in his life. If his clerk Sloan had done wickedness in the back room, why, he was as shocked as any man and heartbroken to be betrayed by one he'd trusted. He nearly made it work. Clara watched 2 of the jurors soften, because the soft voice was a weapon he'd honed for 30 years, and it did not fail him even now. The prosecutor was a young man named Hobbs, sharp but green, and Clara saw he was about to let Holloway climb down clean, so she did a thing a cook has no business doing in a federal courtroom. She tore a corner off her paper and wrote 4 words on it, and passed it up the rail to Hobbs's clerk. Ask him page 91. Hobbs read the scrap. He glanced back at Clara. And then he trusted her, the way men had been learning to trust her all through this, and he lifted the great ledger and set it on the rail in front of Holloway. Mr. Holloway, you say you never knew what your clerk wrote. Would you read the jury page 91, the entry for March 4 years back? In your own hand, sir, not Mr. Sloan's. The court has already had 3 men swear to whose hand it is. Holloway looked down at the page, and Clara watched the soft voice die in his throat, because page 91 was the page where Richard Holloway, in his own bragging hand, had written the bribe to Pardee for the ruin of a sawmill owner, and beneath it, in the same hand, a note to Sloan: redo the Chandler note, the T's too plain, make it lean like the last one. An instruction to forge. In the hand 3 men had sworn was his. "Aye," Holloway said. "That's out of context." "Read it, Mr. Holloway," said the federal judge quiet. He would not. He sat with the ledger open in front of him and his mouth working, and he would not read it, and his silence was louder than any reading, and Clara watched the 2 soft jurors go hard again, and she knew it was finished. Prentice put his silver head down in his hands, and Holloway, cornered at last with his own words staring up at him, made the final error of a cornered, proud man. He shut the ledger and looked out at the courtroom and said low and vicious, "You have no idea how many of these people came to me begging. Half of them would have lost the land anyway. I only hurried what the weather was already doing." A gasp went through the room. They were finished. I merely collected. It was not a confession in words, but it was a confession in the bone, and every soul in that courtroom heard a man who had just called 41 ruined families a harvest he was entitled to reap. Hobbs, the green young prosecutor, was wise enough to say nothing at all. He simply let it hang there, and then said, "No further questions," and sat down, and Holloway understood too late what he'd done. The jury was gone 40 minutes. Clara had thought it might be less. Guilty. On all counts. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy, extortion, arson, bribery of a federal, the attempted murder in the yard, all of it. And the judge, when he passed sentence, ordered every fraudulent note void, every stolen property restored, where it could be restitution paid, where it couldn't. And he read the number of families into the record 41, and said each ruin was a separate wound on the body of the territory, and Richard Holloway would answer for everyone. They took him out in irons the way they'd taken him off his bay horse in Clara's yard, and he did not look soft, and he did not look clever. And passing the rail where Clara sat, he stopped just for a second, held up by the marshal's hand, and looked down at her. "I hope you're satisfied," he said, low and venomous. And Clara Whitmore looked up at the man who had buried her, who had forged her dead husband's hand, and taken her home, and let a whole town decide she was nothing. And she found to her own surprise that she felt no triumph in it at all. Just a great tiredness, and under the tiredness, at last, some peace. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not satisfied. 41 families is nothing to be satisfied about. But I'm not ashamed anymore, Mr. Holloway. And you can't give me back what you took, but you did give me that. You're the reason I spent 2 years believing I was a fool, and you're the reason I know now I never was. I don't hate you. Hating you would be spending more of my life on you, and you've had enough of it." She turned back to the front. "Take him on, Marshal. He's blocking my view of a better day." And they took him on, and that was the last Clara Whitmore ever saw of Richard Holloway. The setting right of it took the whole of the fall and into the first cold of winter, and Clara did most of it because she was the only soul who could read the whole tangled ledger of who owed what and who was owed. Amos Dunmore got his 4,000 acres back before the first snow signed clear, and he stood in the middle of the flat willow he'd broke horses on for 3 years and wept like a boy, and then he rode straight to the telegraph office and wired his wife back east 2 words, "Come home." Micah Mabry's honest note was set right to the penny, and Clara saw to it herself that it was fair, and when it was done, Court Mabry came to her with his hat in his hands and could not get a word out, and Clara let him off the hook of it. "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "You went into a burning building for me, Court. That squares us and then some. Go see your brother. Take your Thursdays off from now on. Lord knows you've earned a Thursday that's your own." The horse trader at the crossroads was run down near the Wyoming line a week later, and turned state's evidence too, and that was the last loose thread of it pulled tight. The 41 families were harder scattered as they were across 2 territories, but one by one Clara found them and wrote them, and where she could she went and she sat at their tables, the way she'd sat at Amos Dunmore's, and she showed each one the same thing, the forged T, the aged ink, the truth of it, and she said to every one of them the same words in the same plain voice. "You weren't a fool, you were robbed. There's all the difference in the world between them, and I've come to hand you back the difference." Some of them wept. Some of them, hardened by years of believing the worst of themselves, could barely take it in. One old woman in Cottonwood who'd lost a boarding house and been sure to her bones it was her own poor management held Clara's hands across her kitchen table and said, all this time I thought it was me." And Clara said, "I know. I thought it about myself too. That's the cruelest part of what he did, worse than the stealing. He stole the money, and then he made us blame ourselves for losing it. But it's over now. You can set that down." Word of it spread the way such things do, and it spread, of course, to Culpeper. The letter came in December, and Clara knew the hand on the envelope before she opened it, a cramped, careful hand she'd last seen on a Christmas card years back. Mrs. Pratt, the woman whose babies Clara had helped birth, who'd stood on her porch and watched Clara put off her land, and said not one word, who'd told the others a body couldn't blame folks for not wanting to look at what Clara had let herself become. Thomas found her holding the unopened letter at the kitchen table. "You don't have to read it," he said. "I know I don't." Clara turned it over in her hands. "That's what's got me. For 2 years, I'd have given anything for that town to know they were wrong about me. I used to lie awake building the speech I'd give them." She almost smiled. "And now it's come, the whole town's found out the large sad widow was right all along, and they want to make it up to me, I expect. And I'm sitting here, and I find I don't much care what's in this letter." She looked up at Thomas. "Is that a hard heart, do you think? That I don't care?" "No," Thomas said. He sat down across from her. "I think it's a healed one. A hurt still open, you'd have torn that envelope. A hurt that's mended, you can hold it and wonder why it doesn't sting. Clara looked at him a long moment. Then she opened the letter after all and read it, and it was everything she'd once dreamed of, and it moved her not at all. Mrs. Pratt was sorry. The whole town was sorry. They'd been cruel and blind, and they knew it now, and there was a place for Clara in Culpeper if she wanted to come home, her farm restored, and the town's arms open, and they hoped she could find it in her Christian heart to forgive them. Clara set the letter down. "They want me to come home," she said. Thomas went very still, the same slight stillness she'd seen in the yard when she'd first spoken of getting her land back, the stillness of a man bracing for a loss. And Clara watched him hold it, watched him get ready to be decent about it, to tell her she should go, to wish her well, and mean it, and break his own heart quietly, the way he'd learned to break it over 5 hard years. And she thought, no, not this time, not this man. "Thomas," she said, "look at me." He looked. "I've got a farm in Culpeper waiting on me restored and clear, and a whole town wanting to weep on my shoulder and tell me how sorry they are. I could go back there tomorrow and be the woman who was right, the woman they wronged, and they'd be kind to me the rest of my days out of guilt." She reached across the table and took both his rough hands in hers. "And I'd rather stay here and be the woman who was hungry and cook for 20, and read a wicked man's books by lamplight, and stand on a porch and not be afraid. Culpeper's got my farm, Thomas. But it never had me, not really. Not once they decided what I was by looking. You're the only soul that ever asked what else I could do." Her voice went thick, and she let it. "So, I'm not going home to Culpeper. I'm already home. I've been home since a tired man on a horse asked a starving woman could she cook for 2. For a moment, Thomas Caldwell couldn't speak at all. Then he stood, and he came around the table, and Clara stood to meet him, and he took his hat off. Though they were indoors, took it off the way Amos had at the foot of her steps, the way a man does before a thing he holds sacred. "The danger's past, Clara," he said rough. "It's been past since they took him out in irons. I've been waiting on your leave to say it, and you said ask when the last stolen acre was handed back, and Amos got his deed a month ago, and I've been carrying this every day since waiting on you to finish, and you've finished." He drew a breath. "I'm 38 years old, and I've buried 1 wife and run this place mean and alone for 5 years, and I never once thought I'd feel like this again, and then you knelt down in my road. I don't want to cook, Clara. I never really did. I've got hands can fry beef. What I want, what I've wanted near since that first supper, is you. All of you. Your 2 good hands, and your quick, sad eyes, and your hard head for figures, and every bit of the rest that a fool town couldn't see past." His voice broke, and he did not try to save it. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me not as my cook, as my wife, and my partner, and the other half of everything I've got? Will you stay?" And Clara Whitmore, who had walked up this man's road 3 months before, with everything she owned in a bag and a dead man's ring in her fist, who had been called the Large Widow by a town that turned its porches to her, who had knelt in the dust and offered to sell the last thing she loved sooner than beg, stood in the warm kitchen she had raised from the dead and looked at the one man in all the world who had bothered to ask what she could do, and she did not make him wait, not 1 second more. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas, I'll stay." The outfit knew before either of them said a word, the way an outfit always knows, and when Clara stepped out onto the porch the next morning to ring the breakfast bell, she found the whole crew lined up in the yard, scrubbed and grinning, and Deke stepped forward with his hat over his heart. "Ma'am," the foreman said gravely, "the boys took a vote." "Did they?" "We did. It were unanimous, which it never is." A rare crease of a smile broke his weathered face. "We voted you can't leave. So if the boss hadn't asked you proper, we was all set to ask you ourselves on his behalf, and it'd have been a good deal less romantic." The men laughed. "But he tells us he did ask. So, when's the wedding, and who's cooking on account of the cook can't be expected to cook her own?" "I'll be cooking," Clara said. "I don't trust a one of you with my kitchen." And the yard roared, and that was how Black River learned it was getting a mistress. They married 3 weeks later, before the deep snow closed the roads in the front room of the ranch house with the furniture pushed back to the walls. There was no church for 40 miles, and no preacher closer than Cottonwood. But the circuit man rode out for it gladly, because word of what the widow had done had traveled every road in the territory, and a preacher likes to be part of a story people will tell. Amos Dunmore gave her away. He'd argued about it standing in the kitchen the night before, said a man ought to have his own father or a brother for such a thing, and Clara had neither living. Said he was nothing but a broke horsebreaker she'd known 3 months. And Clara had set down her rolling pin and looked at him and said, "Amos Dunmore, 3 months ago, you were sleeping in a bunkhouse on land you used to own. Sure to your bones, you were a fool who couldn't do sums, and now you've got 4,000 acres, and a wife coming home on the eastbound, and your own name back. And I've got a name back too, and a home, and a man that asked me what I could do. We were both of us buried Amos, and we both of us came up out of it in the same season, by the same road. There's nobody in this world I'd rather have walk me down that aisle than a man who knows exactly how far it is up out of the ground because he climbed it too." Amos had turned away and wiped his face with the back of his wrist and said gruff that he'd be honored, and that was the end of the argument. So it was Amos Dunmore's arm Clara held walking into that crowded front room, in a good blue dress the women of Cottonwood had sewn her without being asked, and Toby stood up, shining and scrubbed as ring-bearer, and Deke stood at Thomas's shoulder, and Court Mabry was there with his brother Micah beside him, whole and honest and out of debt. And the room was so full of people Holloway had tried to ruin, and hadn't, that Clara could scarcely see the walls. She'd worried in the last days before it about the ring. She still wore Daniel's on her right hand, had worn it every day through everything, and the night before the wedding she'd sat at the kitchen table turning it, and Thomas had found her there the way he was always finding her there. "I don't know what to do about this," she'd said, and held up her hand. Thomas pulled out the chair across from her, the same chair, and sat. "Then don't do anything about it," he said. "I'm not asking you to unlove a good man that died, Clara. Daniel Whitmore kept the books of your heart 8 years and paid every one of them honest, and I'd think less of you if you could set that down easy. You want to move that ring to a chain and wear it under your dress over your heart where it's warm. I'd count myself lucky to marry a woman that loyal. There's room in a big enough life for a grief and a joy both. I've learned that this year. You taught it to me." He reached across and closed her hand gentle around the ring. "Eleanor's buried on that hill yonder, and I visit her Sundays, and I'll love you all the harder for it, not less. Love's not a thing you run out of, Clara. It's about the only thing that isn't." And so Clara wore Daniel's ring on a chain over her heart, and Thomas's ring on her hand. And when the circuit preacher asked, "Did she take this man?" she looked at Thomas Caldwell across a room full of the resurrected, and she said, "I do," so firm. The windows near rattled, and the whole room came apart in cheering. And Toby cried, and Deke pretended he didn't, and outside the first fat flakes of the winter's snow began to fall, like the sky itself was throwing rice. That winter tried to kill them all. It came down hard the week after the wedding, and it did not let up storm on storm, the worst winter the territory had seen in 20 years, and men who'd laughed at Clara's stockpiling in the fall stopped laughing by January, because Clara had stockpiled. All through October and November, while she was riding to the 41 families and back, she'd been laying in hay and cutting oats and salting beef and filling the root cellar and the new pantry to the rafters. And Thomas had watched her do it and asked her once mild if she wasn't overdoing it. "I kept a farm's books 8 years, she'd told him. "You learn one thing above all others, doing that, Thomas, and it's that the year you don't prepare for is the year that comes. A ledger's just a story about the future written careful. And every ledger I've ever read says the same thing in the end. Save in the fat months. The lean ones always come." She'd gone on salting beef. "Besides, I've been hungry. A woman that's been hungry doesn't ever again let a cellar go half full when she can fill it." By February, the whole valley was starving, and Black River was not. The snow lay so deep the cattle couldn't paw down to grass, and outfits all across the high country began to lose stock by the dozen. Then the 100 frozen and starved in the drifts, and men rode into Black River, gaunt and desperate. And Clara fed every one of them, and sent them home with hay on a sledge, and never once asked what they could pay. Some of them were men who'd never have crossed the yard to help her 3 months before. She fed them the same as the rest. "You're giving away the winter stores," Thomas said one night, not angry, only watching her. "The stores that might be the difference if this doesn't break till April." "I know what I'm giving away," Clara said. "And I know to the pound what we've got because I count it every Sunday, and I'm telling you we've got enough for us, and to spare if the calving goes right and the thaw comes by the end of March, which the old ledgers say it will 9 years in 10. She looked up from her book. "But it's more than sums, Thomas. There's a man named Harmon 3 ridges over, laughed me off the road my first week here, called me the boss's fat stray, and he rode in yesterday with his hat in his hands and his children hungry, and I loaded his sledge myself." She closed the ledger. "I could have turned him off. Lord knows he earned it. But I'd rather be the woman who fed the man that mocked her than the woman who let his children starve to make a point. A grudge doesn't warm a cellar, Thomas. And I'd sooner this whole valley remember Black River as the ranch that carried them through the killing winter than as the ranch that had plenty and kept it." The valley remembered. The worst of it came in the 3rd week of February, a blizzard that ran 3 days without mercy, and on the 2nd night of it, a rider half dead of cold pounded on the door near midnight. It was the Cottonwood liveryman, and behind him he gasped. The whole town was near out of fuel and food. The supply road closed a fortnight, an old woman already dead of the cold, and children failing. And there was no one left to turn to but the ranch. Everyone in the territory now knew had a woman who planned for the year that comes. Thomas looked at the storm and looked at Clara. "That's 12 miles in a whiteout," he said. "A man could die making that run. 3 men could." And Clara Whitmore, mistress of Black River, stood in her own doorway. And this time, no one had put her there, and no one could put her out of it, and she did not hesitate. "Then we make it careful," she said. "Deke Court hitch the 2 big sledges and rope them nose to tail, so we don't lose one in the white. Every man ties a line to his saddle and to the man ahead, and nobody rides loose. Toby, you stay and keep the fires and the coffee. And if we're not back by the 2nd dawn, you send to the Dunmores, not before, because I'll not have Amos out in this on a rumor." She was already pulling on Thomas's spare coat over her dress. "Load the sledges heavy. Beef hay for the town stock, every blanket we can spare, and the little cask of whiskey from the cellar for the frostbite, and 1 sack of my good flour, because a child that's been cold to the bone remembers a piece of warm bread the rest of its life, and I'd have Cottonwood remember." "You're not coming," Thomas said. "Clara, I'm coming." She wound a scarf to her eyes. "It's my cellar and my valley and my people now, Thomas Caldwell, mine as much as yours. You said so in front of a preacher 3 months back, and a partner doesn't send her men into a killing storm and sit home by the fire. Now stop wasting the light we haven't got. Rope up." They roped up, and they made the run 12 miles through a screaming white, nothing man tied to sledge. Clara in the middle of the line with a lantern she would not let go out. 6 miles out they near lost Court. A drift gave way under his horse, and the animal went down thrashing, and Court went with it into a hole the storm had hidden, and for one terrible stretch the line snapped taut, and men shouted into a wind that ate the shouting, and no one could see a hand in front of his own face. It was Clara who kept her head. She swung down off her own horse, planted her boots, and hauled on the rope that ran to Court, with the whole broad strength of her calling, steady down the line. "Hold the rope. Don't none of you let go. The rope follow it. Hand over hand to me." And man by man, they pulled themselves along the lifeline to where she stood, and together they dragged Court Mabry and his floundering horse up out of the drift, half froze and coughing snow, alive. "You saved my hide, ma'am," Court gasped when he could speak. "I saved the rope," Clara said. "You saved yourself by tying onto it when I told you, same as you ran into a burning building when it counted. A body that listens gets pulled out of holes, Court. Remember it. Now get back on that horse before you stiffen. We've a town to reach." They reached it. They came into Cottonwood in the black before dawn, with the whole town's salvation dragging behind them on 2 sledges, and they did not lose a man, and they did not lose the flour. They warmed the frozen and fed the failing, and Clara herself broke the loaf still faintly warm from her own oven and put a piece into every child's hands. And a small girl with blue lips looked up at the big woman in the man's coat and whispered, "Are you the angel?" And Clara laughed. The great warm laugh the whole territory would come to know, and said, "No, honey, I'm just the cook. But eat your bread. A cook's a better thing to have on a night like this than any angel I ever heard of." The story of that night made Clara Whitmore something more than respected in the territory. It made her loved. For years after in Cottonwood, there were children grown to men and women who remembered the winter they nearly died, and remembered the piece of warm bread a broad woman in a man's coat pressed into their frozen hands in the dark, and told their own children about it, so that Clara passed into the kind of legend a hard country keeps of the few souls who were good to it when it counted. The thaw came the last week of March 9 years in 10, just as the old ledgers said, and when the snow drew back off the valley and the counting of the winter's cost began. Black River had lost fewer than 40 head in the worst winter in 20 years, while outfits all around had lost half their herds and some the whole. The cattle Clara had wintered fat and careful came through strong, and the calves dropped healthy in April, and by the time the eastern buyers rode up the greening roads that Spring Black River had the finest, fullest herd in the high country to sell, and it sold high because a scarce good thing always does. Thomas found her at the corral fence the evening the buyers left the biggest bank draft the ranch had ever seen folded in his shirt. "We're clear," he said, and his voice was strange with it. "Every debt, every note, all of it. And more besides, more than I've had since Eleanor, more than my father had before me. Black River's not just saved Clara. It's the richest outfit between here and the river." He turned the draft over in his hands, like he couldn't believe the weight of it. "A year ago I was a beat man waiting on a soft-voiced banker to take everything I had. And now," Clara said, "and now I want to do a thing and I want you to let me." He put the draft away and took both her hands. "I'm going to town Monday, and I'm going to have the deed to this ranch redrawn, and I'm going to put your name on it next to mine. Equal. Not Thomas Caldwell's wife. Clara Caldwell, half owner of Black River in ink in the county book, where no man can ever smile it away." His jaw worked. "Because it's yours. You saved it twice from the banker and from the winter, and I'll not have the paper lie about who built this. My father's ranch, my grandfather's, and now yours as much as mine, and I'm prouder to write your name on it than I've ever been of anything I've done." And Clara, who had once stood in a doorway holding a ledger that lied and been told a woman alone with no man to speak for her, had no standing to argue. A figure looked at the man offering to write her name into the permanent record of the world, and she could not speak for a moment. "You know what that is, Thomas," she managed. "A name on a deed in the county book. Tell me. It's the one thing a forger can't undo. Holloway spent 11 years proving a paper's only as good as the honest hand that writes it. Well," she squeezed his hands hard, "you write my name on that deed in your own honest hand, and you've done the opposite of everything that man ever did. He wrote lies to take homes away. You're writing truth to give one." She laughed, wet and helpless. Yes, put my name on it. And then let's fill this place so full it never stands empty again." They did. The years came on their way. Good years do quiet and full, and Black River grew, and it grew a particular reputation because Clara Caldwell ran the business of it now openly and without apology, and the business of it prospered. She kept the books herself, every figure in her firm hand, that never blotted, and no man who traded with Black River ever found a phantom fee or a doubled charge, because the woman across the table had learned exactly what those were the hard way, and would sooner have cut off her hand than write one. Buyers came from 3 territories to deal with her because a fair dealer is rarer than a rich mine, and word gets around. And she did one thing more every year that she never once explained to the men who worked for her, though Thomas knew and loved her the more for it. Whenever a widow came through, or a family put off their land, or a soul walking north with everything they owned in a bag, Clara fed them, and sat them at her table, and asked them not what they'd lost, but what they could do. She hired more hands than the ranch strictly needed, and half of them were people the rest of the world had decided were finished. A widow who could figure. A ruined man who knew cattle. A girl the town said was too plain or too poor or too broad to amount to anything put to work in Clara's kitchen, and taught that her hands and her head counted for more than her face ever would. Black River became known in a quiet way as the place that took in the ones nobody else would read twice, and it never once lost by it, because Clara Caldwell had learned the great secret. Richard Holloway never had that the most valuable thing in the world is the worth that everyone else has overlooked. There was a widow named Ruth. She took in one hard spring, a woman so beaten down she flinched when spoken to, and Clara handed her the ledgers, and by that autumn Ruth was keeping the whole of Black River's accounts, and standing straight and looking men in the eye, and Clara watched her do it and understood she was watching herself 2 years back come up out of the ground one more time. Toby grew up on that ranch and became its foreman when Deke got too old for the saddle and named his first daughter Clara. Court Mabry stayed 12 years and left only to run his brother's spread beside him, and the two Mabry places between them ran cattle clear to the Judith. Amos Dunmore's wife came home on the eastbound that first spring, and they had grandchildren on the Flat Willow, and every Christmas a sledge came from the Dunmores to the Caldwells piled with gifts, and every Christmas one went back. Clara never did go home to Culpeper. She sold the restored farm 2 years on, sold it to a young couple just starting, and cut the price near in half when she learned the wife was expecting, and she never set foot in that town again. Not out of anger, for the anger had long since burned to nothing, but because she had learned the thing. It takes some people a whole life to learn, and some people never learn at all. Home was not the place you were from. Home was the place that asked what you could do and then let you do it. She and Thomas never had children of their own, and that was a quiet grief between them for a while in the early years. But the ranch filled up regardless with hands and their families, and the strays, Clara could never turn away, and Toby's Clara and the Mabry children and the Dunmore grandbabies underfoot every holiday. And one autumn, Thomas stood on the porch and looked at a yard full of people who owed their whole lives to the woman beside him and said, "You know, I used to think a man built a life alone. Grit and hard work and no help wanted. I ran this place 5 years that way after Eleanor, and it near killed me, and it was empty as a drum." He put his arm around her. "And then a hungry woman knelt down in my road and taught me the truest thing I ever learned. A person doesn't build a life alone, Clara. Nobody worth a damn ever did. You build it with the ones you're brave enough to say yes to." Clara leaned into him, older now. Gray coming into her hair, her hands more worn than ever and steadier than ever, and she watched the children chase the last light across the yard, where she had once knelt in the dust, with a dead man's ring held out in a shaking hand, and she thought about the road she'd walked up so long ago, ready to starve honest sooner than be looked at one more time. She had been so sure on that road that her story was already over, that she was nothing but the large, sad widow of Culpeper. A woman things happened to a field the weather worked its will on. She had believed what the world told her, believed it so deep she'd near lain down and died of it on a stranger's fence line. And then a tired man on a horse had asked her one small question. Not whether she was pretty, not whether she'd let herself go, not whether she fit some town's idea of a proper frontier woman. He'd asked her whether there was use in her, whether she could do a plain, hard, needful thing. "Can you cook for two?" She had straightened her shoulders that day with every ache in her body and every blister on her heel, and she had said the truest words she ever spoke. "I can cook for 20. And she had been wrong, even then, wrong by every measure that came after, because it turned out she could do so much more than cook, and cook for so many more than 20. She could read the lie a wicked man spent 11 years building and tear it down in a fortnight. She could stand in a federal courtroom and turn a jury with nothing but arithmetic and her own plain honesty. She could hand 41 broken families back the truth that they were never fools. She could rope a line of men through a killing storm and drag a whole town back from the edge of dying. She could build the finest ranch in the high country and fill it with the very people the world had thrown away and prove over and over, year on year, decade on decade, that worth is not a thing you can see by looking. The town of Culpeper had decided what Clara Whitmore was by looking at her, and they had been wrong about every single thing. Richard Holloway had decided the same, and it had cost him everything he had. And a lonely widowed rancher had refused to decide anything at all until he'd asked, and it had given him back his whole life, and hers besides. People in the towns told the story for 50 years. They told how Thomas Caldwell rebuilt Black River from a beaten thing to the greatest ranch in the territory, but they told about Clara more. They told about the widow. Everyone underestimated the woman a whole town threw away, who walked up a lonesome road with nothing but a bag and a ring, and rose to run the richest outfit in the high country, and carry a valley through its darkest winter, and never once, not for one day of it, let anyone tell her again what she was worth. They told it to their daughters especially. Mothers told it to daughters who'd been told they were too plain, too poor, too broad, too much, and daughters told it to daughters after them. So that long after Clara Caldwell was laid to rest on the hill beside Thomas and Eleanor, both under a stone that read simply. She asked what they could do. The story went on, doing its quiet work in the world, teaching girls who had been looked at and dismissed the one thing Clara had learned the hardest way there is, that a person is never only what the world can see of her, that the figures the world writes about you are not the true accounting, and can be checked and challenged and proved false by anyone brave enough to do the arithmetic. That being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and that the whole distance between them is nothing but one soul willing at last to read you twice. Clara Whitmore knelt in the dust, a starving widow that nobody wanted. And by the following winter she ran the whole ranch, and by the end of her long, full life she had run so much more than that. She had run a stagecoach line of second chances, a rescue for the discarded, a standing argument against every town that ever decided a woman's worth by the size of her. And she had won that argument so completely that the world tells her story still. She was hungry once and proud and sure her life was over. She was wrong about the last part. She was the survivor who became a leader, the widow who became a partner, the stray who became the very heart of the greatest ranch in Montana, and the woman the world threw away, who spent the rest of her days catching everyone else the world threw after her. And that in the end was the whole worth of Clara Caldwell, written down at last, in a hand no forger could ever copy, and no town could ever smile away. She was never the woman they said she was, and she proved it, and she is proving it still.